Welcome to another edition of Diving Gone Wrong. In this video, we're going to go over 3 stories about diving that combine all of the elements of claustrophobia, thalassophobia, and everything else about the deep ocean we find terrifying. And if for some reason you happen to be on a submarine right now, you might want to skip this one. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Quickly, before we get into today's stories, this video is brought to you by Endel. I spend a ton of time researching and writing scripts for this channel, and inevitably, I lose focus. I've tried to use music to combat this, but I find song lyrics distracting, and having to switch songs takes me out of the zone. Thankfully, Endel has a better solution. Using cutting-edge AI technology, Endel generates real-time, personalized soundscapes for you based on your location, weather, heart rate, and the type of activity you're doing. So if you just need to focus like I do, Endel can generate sounds to help boost your productivity. If you just want to relax, Endel can generate sounds to calm and comfort you. Endel can even generate sounds to help soothe you to sleep. And these are all completely seamless, meaning you'll never have to switch songs. These can all be changed or adapted for whatever mood you're in and whatever platform you're on. In fact, the soundscape you're hearing right now is one that Endel generated just for me. So if you feel like Endel would be perfect for you, click the link on screen now or in the description below, because the first 100 people to download Endel will get a free week of audio experiences, like the one you're hearing now, but completely customized just for you. With that said, let's get into today's video. Born in Wasaga Beach, Canada, Luke practically grew up in the water. From a young age, he just loved being around it and swimming and scuba diving and sailboating, and because of this love for the water, he eventually turned his passion for diving into a career at around the age of 34 when he switched professions to become a commercial diver. According to his mother, in addition to his general love for exploring, he also wasn't afraid to take risks, which is generally what most people consider commercial diving to be. Then at the age of 39, he married a lovely woman named Cheryl, and the two of them moved out to Nova Scotia, Canada, which is on Canada's east coast, on the Atlantic Ocean. About 3 months after the two of them were married in July, Luke was at work getting ready to perform the annual inspection of something known as a sluice gate at the Nova Scotia Power tidal plant. In this area of the Atlantic, near the famous Bay of Fundy, the tides are higher than anywhere else on Earth. In the most extreme areas, this difference is up to 53 feet or 16 meters of water between low tide and high tide. In fact, it's so extreme that it's totally normal to walk around at low tide and see boats sitting on the dry seabed. Then just a few hours later, they're sitting in deep water again. It really is incredible. This power plant that he was inspecting took advantage of all of this moving water and used it to turn turbines to generate electricity, and this required large gates to control the flow of water. These look a little bit like the blade of a guillotine, except instead of a blade, it's more like a giant wall of metal or concrete to block the flow of water. When the wall is raised, water flows through, and when the wall is lowered, the water is blocked. And understandably, to ensure that these are functioning properly, occasionally somebody needs to go down and actually get a look at them to ensure they're free of debris and damage. So Luke suited up in his diving suit, which looked a little bit different than your normal scuba gear. For commercial diving, divers often have an umbilical cord attached to them to supply them with air rather than tanks. This way, they can stay down indefinitely without running out of air. Once this was all tested and ready to go, Luke slipped into the water for what was going to be at least 15 minutes of work. Then, just a minute or two into the dive, Luke signaled that he wanted to be pulled up, but before they could grab him, the line went completely taut. The surface team tried to pull against it, but it was as if it was fixed in place. Despite all of them pulling on it, it didn't budge at all. So not wanting for him to get pulled further, just in case, they tied off what they could and just waited helplessly. The reason this was all happening was that they'd made a crucial mistake before entering the water. They never completed something known as the bag test. It's very simple. You take a bag with a small weight inside, tie a line to it, and then you drop it in the water along the length of the dive area. If the bag stays stable and there's no pull, that means there's no current. If there is pull, there's some current somewhere in the water and it's not safe to enter. Had they done that day, they would have realized that despite the plant lockout control showing that the sluice gate was closed, it was actually open about 12 inches or 30 centimeters. With it open, Luke was being pulled into this opening by the force of the entire Atlantic tide, which can be literal tons of pressure. The reason they couldn't pull him at all was because of this incredibly strong suction force pulling his body into this small opening, and it would take a full hour before the pressure finally equalized in the area for them to finally be able to descend and see his condition. Entering the water once again, a diver went down and found Luke's body wedged underneath the sluice gate. His helmet was firmly jammed inside, his ribs were broken, his suit was torn, and tragically, his mouthpiece was out of his mouth. It's not clear exactly the sequence of events, but ultimately it seems as though he drowned as he was being crushed in between the opening. This, believe it or not, is the leading cause of death among commercial divers, specifically a phenomenon known as delta P, or pressure differential. In the industrial world, everything is just larger, the intake pipes, the structures, and consequently, all of the forces involved. Getting caught in the suction or flow of some of these can mean certain death in most cases, if not from the force alone, but then getting stuck or running out of air, and occasionally, it's even worse than that. Despite how different they are, planes and submarines share a unique ability to provide us comfort in extreme conditions. For those of us who are comfortable with flying, the feeling is not so different from sitting in the seat of a coach bus. We hardly think about the fact that outside of a thin sheet of metal, it's negative 50 degrees, the air is too thin to breathe, and we're suspended 30,000 feet in the air. It's almost too comforting given how harsh the conditions are outside. And I've never been on a submarine, but I imagine that the feeling is probably not that different from a plane. There too, a thin sheet of metal is all that separates you from the complete darkness of the deep ocean, the crushing pressure, and the unbreathable liquid. On the contrary, although they are rare, incidents have occurred where this thin sheet of metal is the only thing that has prevented people from reaching safety, especially early in their inception. Interestingly, the first designs for submarines date back at least several centuries. They weren't exactly the deep-sea variety that we know today, but the concept was more or less the same. They'd have some sort of air chamber that had sailors underneath the water instead of on top of it like traditional boats. Early designs even had oars because they were human-powered. The first fully mechanical sub dates back to the mid-19th century, but these weren't really widely used until World War I, when they start to become an invaluable piece of any military, and this would be the case from then on. Today, every capable military has subs in its fleet. Just prior to World War II, the Royal Navy of England was in the middle of producing a brand new fleet of subs known as the T1 class. These were an upgrade to all of their old subs and would be the latest and greatest diesel-electric subs they possessed at the time. In total, over the course of several years, they produced 53 of this class, one of which was named the HMS Thetis. This was the 25th produced, finished in 1938, and ended up being 275 feet long. It could support 50 full-time crew and travel over 8,000 kilometers before needing to resupply. Following its completion, it was due for a sea trial on the 1st of July, so rather than the normal crew of 50, it was carrying a total of 103 men in celebration of it being finished. The majority of these were sailors, but at the last minute, all of the engineers decided to stay on the board to join the Navy for a celebratory buffet. Then in addition to these men, there were a few high-ranking officials and 2 catering staff to prepare the food. Once everyone was on board, the sub then set sail from Birkenhead en route to Liverpool Bay. When they were about 12 miles off the coast, the lieutenant on board needed to add some water to the sub to increase its weight because it was running light and was having trouble diving. Now, the way that the system was set up on this sub was that there were 6 ballast tubes, each with an outer hatch and an inner hatch. These tubes could then be filled with water to increase the weight of the sub. To open these hatches, there was a series of circular valves that were labeled from 1 to 6. Under normal conditions, spinning the valve in one direction closed the hatch and spinning in the other opened it up. Except for reasons that are unclear to this day, the outer hatch on 5 was already open. In addition to this, the shut position on valve 5 was a mirror image of valve 6 right above it. So when the lieutenant adjusted these valves, he accidentally opened the inner hatch of tube 5, causing water to come pouring into the sub. He quickly shut it again, but by then, tons of water had already weighed down the end and caused the bow to sink directly to the sea floor. Thankfully, there was no immediate danger and no one was hurt, but the way that the sub was positioned meant that the end was just barely at the water's surface. This also meant that the intake for fresh air was submerged, preventing the sub from being able to recirculate oxygen back in, meaning they were on a countdown to eventually running out of air. Shortly after the initial sinking, an emergency buoy was sent up to flag down any passing ships. Then, a couple hours after they had gone radio silent, a ship they had been in communication with sent out a message that they were no longer responding. This was around the time an official search was launched. Unfortunately, the nearest rescue ships were hundreds of miles away, which guaranteed that it would be at least several more hours before the men inside were rescued. So hours went by as the carbon dioxide levels slowly got higher and higher inside the contained chamber, eventually causing the men to get very sleepy. As time passed, the crew resorted to dumping all of their fresh water and all of their fuel oil to lighten the ship and get the emergency hatch closer to the water's surface. It had become apparent that they couldn't wait for rescue any longer or they risked dying. They would need to use the sub's emergency exit instead. The next problem was that this hatch was only large enough for one person to exit at a time, and similar to the ballast tubes, there was one hatch in and one hatch out, so each man had to enter the tube and then close it behind himself. Then he had to equalize the pressure to the water outside by filling the chamber with water, and it needed to be completely full before the hatch could be opened. So just imagine, you're in a tiny metal chamber, you have to sit in potentially freezing water until you're completely submerged. Then on a breath hold, you have to open the chamber, shut it behind you, and then swim to the surface. It's also unclear exactly how far this hatch was from the surface, so it could have been right there, or it could have been a decent swim. In any case, one by one, the men started going through the sequence to escape the sub. 4 of them escaped without issue, and then a 5th man entered the chamber, ready to escape to the surface. He closed the hatch behind him and started to let water into the room with him. The water slowly rose higher and higher, and then he started to panic. In his panic, he opened the hatch early, causing the water to rush in from above, and tragically, somehow, during these events, he drowned inside the chamber. This also meant that the outer hatch was now stuck open, which prevented any of the other men from being able to use the escape hatch. And at this point, only 4 of the total 103 on board had been able to escape, and the air they were breathing was dangerously low on oxygen. Then, even more tragically, due to a combination of blunders, because of the unexpected nature of this incident, the rescue ship wouldn't get there until 13 hours from the time that the sub first went down. In addition to a ship capable of rescue being so far away, the sub was difficult to locate by planes flying overhead. Then, because there was no radio communication, it wasn't realized until later that they needed equipment to cut into the ship. Finally, when a capable rescue ship arrived on scene, a thick cable was attached to the end sticking out of the water to hold it in place. But because of the weight and movement of the water, this snapped and sent the sub plunging to the seabed. By then, even if any of the men on board were still alive, this made it impossible to mount a rescue. The technology simply did not exist to reach the men in time. With hope abandoned, the rescue turned into a salvage operation, and it would take another 4 months to finally retrieve the Thetis from the seafloor. On May 14, 1972, a ship known as the Fredbearer was deliberately sunk off the coast of Key West, Florida, to a depth of 330 feet to create an artificial reef. Just like actual reefs, artificial ones can help promote marine life, control erosion on the seafloor, and prevent ships from passing through or using large trawling nets. About a year later, scientists were trying to figure out how the local marine life was responding to this new feature, so a fish trap was lowered to the wreckage. After it had spent a day resting on the bottom, it was then due to be collected once again, but because of how delicate a job this is, a special submersible needed to be used. The one that was chosen is a vehicle known as the Johnson Sea-Link. This pickup truck-sized vehicle is completely unique compared to both traditional boats and submarines. At the front, there's a large transparent sphere made of 4 inches thick acrylic. This is the pilot's sphere and gives up to 2 people almost a 360-degree view unobscured. It almost looks a little bit like a helicopter bubble. Then behind this sphere is the dive compartment, which is an 8-foot-long cylinder with about a 5-foot diameter. This compartment has a window into the pilot's sphere, along with portholes on either side, and can hold another 2 to 3 people. This compartment also has a hatch on the bottom, not too unlike the escape hatch from the previous story. This allows commercial divers to equalize the pressure and exit through the bottom to leave the compartment and work in the water. In addition to these two compartments, the Sea Link has life support systems that allow the crew to stay in the water for hours at a time, as deep as the sea floor. In fact, it can actually sit on the bottom and move around relatively precisely at depths of up to 1,000 feet. The motors can be rotated and powerful lights illuminate a large area around the ship. Because of this, it functions almost like a mobile dive bell or observation deck for commercial or scientific work. Then, on the 17th of July, 1973, the fish trap was scheduled to be retrieved from the wreckage. For this trip, there would be 4 people. There was the pilot Archie, who had already done over 100 dives on the Sea Link before this. Dr. Robert would be accompanying Archie in the pilot sphere as a scientific observer. Not only was he a highly experienced diver, his PhD work was in pressure physiology. Then in the dive compartment would be Albert and Edwin, both of which were also experienced divers. They were going to be observing as training if they need to work from the Sea Link at a later date. Ordinarily, they'd have dive equipment on, but because this was purely observational, when they arrived on the deck to meet, they were wearing just shorts and t-shirts. Upon seeing this, Robert mentioned to them that it was going to get quite cold at depth, but the two of them just sort of shrugged it off. Knowing that this would be a short trip as well, Robert did the same, and then all 4 of them then entered the Sea Link, where it was positioned on the deck of the ship. Following their pre-descent check, the submersible was lowered into the water, and then at 8:36 a.m., it detached from the ship and started descending. About 9 minutes later, it reached a depth of 340 feet, or 106 meters, and started moving in the direction of the wreckage. At this depth, visibility was poor, but soon enough, they passed the ship's anchor chain, then they passed over the wreckage and landed on the seafloor about 40 feet from the fish trap. Archie then pointed the Sea Link directly facing the fish trap and positioned the motors in such a way that they became negatively buoyant. This way, they reduced their risk of a current sending them upward and crashing into the hull of the wreckage. Then they started moving forward directly toward the fish trap to use a forked-shaped retrieving lance on the front of the sub to grab a line attached to the trap. Once they were close enough, Archie got it dead on, but the spring on the lance wasn't activating and closing around the line. He repositioned 2 more times and tried to grab the line but was unsuccessful each time. On the 3rd time, he let the bow down just a few degrees, causing the stern to lift up an equal amount. Then, because the lance wasn't closing, he decided to abort for the time being and would come back to make another attempt at a later time. He then backed the Sea Link away from the wreckage exactly as he came in, but all of a sudden, the ship jerked to a stop. Because of the shape of the Sea Link and all the small pieces of metal that stick out from it, as he repositioned, a steel cable running along the wreckage had wrapped around them. Archie tried to move around and free the ship, but pretty quickly realized that he might be making it worse. In their current position, the ship was able to rotate 270 degrees with about 20 feet of slack in the cable, but not being able to see exactly how it was positioned, they risked getting even more stuck. The 4 of them then discussed what the best course of action was and decided that it was probably best to simply radio up to the ship and request help. So at 9:53 a.m., a message was sent up explaining the situation to the surface crew. This message was then relayed to the Coast Guard at just after 10 a.m. and suggested that they might need Navy divers to come and untangle them from the wreckage. In this message, they also explicitly stated that the crew was in no imminent danger because that's what they believed to be the case. Unbeknownst to the crew, though, of both the submersible and the surface ship, a crucial mistake had been made calculating how much breathable air they'd have at depth. The life support system on the Sea Link uses a substance known as bear lime to absorb the excess CO2 breathed out by the crew. Without it, the CO2 levels can become toxic. The original calculations showed that they'd have enough for 61 hours in the dive compartment and 42 hours in the pilot's compartment at a temperature of 70 Fahrenheit or 21 Celsius. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't be an issue because the Sea Link wouldn't be at depth for long enough for it to get very cold inside. But because they were now going to be stuck for hours, the sub would get very cold and significantly reduce the bear lime's ability to absorb CO2. And this was especially the case in the dive compartment, which is mostly made of aluminum. Following the distress signal, the crew inside the Sea Link contemplated locking out the dive chamber and sending one or both of the men in the water to try and entangle it themselves. But what they realized was that they'd need to pressurize the back chamber to do this and change the composition of the air they were breathing. In the short term, this change in gas mixture wouldn't be a problem, but if they were unsuccessful and still need to wait for a rescue ship, the gas would be toxic to them long before it arrived. After coming to this realization, they decided that despite how uncomfortably cold it was becoming inside the chamber, they'd have no other choice but to wait. About 2 hours after they sent out the message, the surface crew set up a line with a buoy on the end to mark off the approximate position of the Sea Link. That way, when the divers arrived, they could head straight into the water. This proved to be much more difficult than what they expected when the line became tangled in another line to mark off the wreckage. While all of this was going on, a ship known as the Tringa was being prepared with equipment and crew to leave Key West at about 3 p.m. that afternoon. And it was only just before this ship left that someone on board the Sea Link realized their calculations needed to be redone. This was the first time they realized that their situation was much more desperate than they initially thought. At 4:15 p.m., the Tringa finally arrived on scene and immediately got to work setting up a 4-point mooring. This ended up being an incredibly time-consuming process and took all the way until 8 p.m. to get set up and secure the Tringa in place. Unfortunately, this was crucial to do because the divers would be on umbilicals attached to the ship. If the boat moved, they could be ripped through the water or have their equipment ripped off while they were at depth. And as all this was taking place, the barrel line was becoming more and more ineffective. The rear compartment of the sub was down to just 42 Fahrenheit or 5 Celsius, and the 2 men in this compartment were on the verge of hypothermia. Then at around 10 p.m., the barrel line had been completely exhausted, and Albert and Edwin switched to tanks that were stored in the compartment. At the same time, the pressure in the compartment started to rise inexplicably. By the time the Navy divers got into the water at 10:45, the pressure had risen to 2 times the pressure at sea level. Then, by the time they made their way down to the wreckage, the pressure increased to 3 times sea level, forcing the 2 inside the dive chamber to switch to a mixture of oxygen and helium. The pressure was becoming so high that they start to experience nitrogen narcosis if they didn't. Then, finally, over 12 hours after they first got stuck, the Navy divers got down to 316 feet, just above the wreckage. When they got down there, they realized that the only path to the ceiling was completely obstructed by the ship. They also risked getting stuck in the debris before ever reaching them. So upon seeing this, they were forced to head back up to the surface for the Tringa to try to reposition for them to descend again from a better angle. At midnight, the pressure inside the dive chamber had increased to 10 times the pressure at sea level and had now equalized to the pressure on the ocean floor. With that, the men opened the bottom hatch and contemplated heading out in a last desperate attempt to untangle the cord. At this point, they had almost no gas left and they were desperately cold. The mixture of oxygen and helium they were breathing caused heat to be expelled much more quickly, in addition to the already low temperature inside the chamber and the fact that they were wearing shorts and t-shirts. And because of how cold they were, they decided against leaving the ceiling and hoped that another diver would be able to get down in time. Throughout this, Archie was in constant communication with the surface team, trying to coordinate the Tringa's new position. At just after 1 a.m., as the divers were getting ready to enter the water again, Archie and Robert looked into the dive compartment and saw that Albert and Edwin were convulsing on the floor of the chamber. They called out to them, but there was no response. This made it absolutely crucial that they get them up to the surface right away. Then at 1:35 a.m., the Navy divers entered the water again, and 8 minutes later they were just above the wreckage. This time, they'd somehow managed to be even farther away than the previous dive. Neither party could even see the lights of one another, and with limited distance on their cables, they had no other option but to return to the surface once again. An hour later, another ship arrived on scene, this time with a dive bell to lower into the water. Divers could then be brought down almost the entire way and then be able to get much closer to the wreckage. Unfortunately, it took another 3 hours for this to be lowered when it was finally lowered at 6 a.m. It was quickly brought down to 282 feet, and then a diver exited, hoping to get to the ceiling. As soon as he left the chamber, though, the current was so strong that he was immediately wrapped up in his own lines, forcing him to abandon this attempt and the use of the dive bell entirely. In order to properly decompress the diver, this was finally brought up at 9:20 a.m., now over 24 hours since the divers entered the water. And despite the acrylic bubble maintaining a warmer temperature than the dive compartment, the barrel line in this chamber was now getting low as well. Despite all of this, it would take all the way until noon for a new ship to arrive that was a salvage vessel with a unique unmanned platform with a camera attached. This could be sent down and controlled by the surface team. So finally at 3 p.m., the surface team was able to get a clear, unobscured view of the sea link on the ocean floor. The platform was then raised, prongs were attached to it, and sent right back down. This time it managed to attach to the sea link, where it was finally pulled from the wreckage and to the surface. Archie and Robert were unharmed, but it was now 14 hours since there were any signs of life from Albert and Edwin. Immediately, an oxygen-helium mixture was pumped into the pressurized chamber, and hot water was sprayed over the outside to warm the interior up. From outside, everyone watched anxiously as the chamber was warmed, but the men inside showed no signs of life. Eventually, doctors on scene felt that there was no hope for the men, and they were tragically pronounced dead. Once the chamber was brought to normal pressure, they were finally removed and transported to a hospital in Key West to have their autopsies performed. It was determined that they died of carbon dioxide poisoning. Thanks so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Imagine you were standing on a massive sheet of ice floating in the North Atlantic Ocean, and your ship and only salvation was impossible to see in the snowstorm that surrounded you, and every minute that went by was 1 minute closer to the frozen night, during which some of the men with you wouldn't wake up in the morning. This is the horrifying story of the 1914 sealing disaster. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The commercial sealing industry was a thriving one early in the 20th century for the island of Newfoundland, which is a little island on the east coast of Canada. And Newfoundland's capital city, St. John's, couldn't have been more perfectly placed geographically for sealing companies. Exiting the harbor there put ships right into the North Atlantic Ocean, which was abundant with their catch, which were seals. In recent decades, seal hunting's become highly controversial, and for good reason, but more than 100 years ago, it quite literally built communities like St. John's. A significant percentage of its population were either actual seal hunters or worked for a sealing company in some capacity, so it was hugely relied upon by many. As you might imagine, the work of the average seal hunter was as grueling as it was gruesome. It was messy, physical work with little safety regulation typical of the time period. This often resulted in overworked crews that spent up to 12 hours straight on sheets of ice known as ice floes. Because that's where seals spend most of their time, seal hunters would be dropped off on the ice and then have to walk miles to reach these herds. Then after a successful hunt, they'd have to walk the same distance back to the ship. This was standard practice because seal herds would get spooked if a ship just pulled up alongside them. In addition to that, ships could only get as close as their equipment would allow in the thick ice. And this is all before taking the unpredictable weather of the North Atlantic into account. Strong storms could hit with little warning, and this is especially true as seasons transition between fall and winter and spring. In April, these ice floes, which can grow up to 6 miles wide, start to melt and become fragile or break apart entirely. This allows ships to get through the ice much easier than in the colder months, but that's only if a ship has strong icebreaking capabilities. Icebreaker ships have a specially shaped and reinforced bow to help break apart and push the ice out of the way. Even with that special hull, ships could still get stuck, but this was especially true for those with a traditional hull. They could easily get stuck in the ice for days, and that is exactly what happened to the SS Newfoundland during the last days of March 1914. Built in 1872, the Newfoundland was a cargo ship with a pretty average capacity, and at no point did icebreaking come up in the design plans. This is because there was just no reason to put an icebreaking hull on a cargo ship, since they can simply move to a more southern shipping lane in the winter. Sealing ships, on the other hand, had no choice since ice is where the seals are. After spending the first part of its career lugging cargo as it was designed, the Newfoundland was bought and repurposed as a sealing ship. Without an icebreaking hull though, it was a sealing ship in name only. In addition to that, among the other ships in the area, the Newfoundland was one of the smaller ones at just 212 feet long with a beam just 29 feet wide. It also had a 2-cylinder compound steam engine that maxed out at only 130 horsepower. This did next to nothing to assist in clearing any ice from the ship's path. Basically, compared to a purpose-built sealing ship, the Newfoundland's captain and crew were at a serious disadvantage. So on March 30th, 1914, the Newfoundland ground to a halt while trying to work its way through an ice floe. The ship's captain on this run was Westbury Keene, the 27-year-old son of Abram Keene. In any other world, someone his age in that position was unheard of, but because of his father, he was pretty much guaranteed a promising career in sealing. This was because Abram wasn't just a ship captain, he was sort of a legend in the industry. Later, when he started a family, he had his sons alongside him on the bridge as soon as they were old enough. It was only a matter of time before they became captains of their own ships. As Westbury looked out of his binoculars while his crew struggled in vain to free the ship, he spotted his father's ship, the SS Stefano, in the distance. Abram and Westbury worked for competing sealing companies, so despite their relationship, helping one another was strictly prohibited. But they did it anyway. Knowing they were under the microscope of the entire Newfoundland sealing industry though, they were discreet in their communication, so they came up with a signal. If either of them had spotted a seal herd, that ship would raise its derrick, which is a wooden crane on the deck used for loading and unloading. If the derrick was raised on one ship, the other would head in that direction, and since a raised derrick wasn't anything out of the ordinary for a ship, it was perfectly inconspicuous. As Westbury focused in on the Stefano, he suddenly wished he and his father had developed a signal for needing help getting unstuck from the ice. Because while assisting a competitor in finding seal herds was a no-no, ships could give or receive help in an emergency from any ship. Unlike the Newfoundland, the Stefano was a powerful icebreaker, which would have been extremely helpful, especially considering the ship had no radio. In fact, wireless communication was installed in ships almost by default around this time, but sealing companies didn't invest in these very expensive systems. The company who owned the ship had one installed to see if it would boost revenue by helping ships coordinate, but after several months with no change, they had it removed and then sold. To make the situation even more frustrating, when Westbury could see the deck of the Stefano clearly, he spotted its derrick in the raised position. This meant that not only were they stuck, but they might miss out on whatever herd that his father had spotted. This left him with a difficult decision to make. He had to decide if he should try to send his crew to the Stefano on foot or just chalk this up as a missed opportunity. If there were only a few miles between the ships, there'd be nothing to consider, but Westbury estimated the distance to the Stefano to be between 5 and 7 miles. It wasn't unheard of to send crew that far, but that kind of distance created a lot of inefficient work, and that was a lot of time dedicated to a single hunt. In fact, if the signal had come from anyone but his father, he would have just kept his men aboard, but he knew that his father knew how to find large seal herds, which would make the extra distance worth it. While discussing this with Thomas Dawson, who was one of his masters of watch, Westbury made his decision and told Thomas that he was going to send the men to the Stefano on foot first thing in the morning. Since it would likely be a long day with a lot of work to do, Westbury told Thomas the crew could just stay the night on the Stefano instead of walking back the same day. Thomas then spread the word among the other men, and at 7 o'clock the next morning, 166 of the Newfoundland's crew gathered on the ice around their ship. The last man off was Westbury's second hand, George Tuft, who would be in command of the crew on the hunt. He was given orders to report to the Stefano and then get the location of the seal herd, and with that, the men set off across the ice. As Westbury watched the crew leave, he felt even more confident that this was the right decision. That morning was overcast with very little wind, visibility was also great, and the temperature was mild. Unfortunately, even despite these good conditions, the crew ran into problems almost immediately after leaving. Because of the warm spring weather, the ice floes were littered with weak spots. Every step the men took needed to be a cautious one, and the longer this went on, the longer the trek took. And even though they were careful, inevitably some of the men crashed through the ice into the freezing Atlantic before the crewmates would rush over to pull them out. When they were pulled back up onto solid ice, the soaked men had no choice but to continue on with the rest of the crew. To make matters worse, if the Stefano was somewhere between the 5 to 7 miles, like Westbury believed, the walk should have taken around 2.5 hours to complete. But it wasn't until 10 o'clock, 3 hours up to the left, when they reached just the halfway point. Thankfully, from there on, the ice was smooth and solid, so they could at least pick up the pace, but getting to that point had been exhausting. Around this time as well, a light snow began to fall, and while this was far from out of the ordinary, some of the men expressed concerns that things might get worse when they noticed how much the temperature had dropped since they left. Then, when some of the crewmen toward the back of the group had killed and collected 6 stray seals along the walk, they decided to take them back to the Newfoundland right away, rather than drag them the rest of the way to the Stefano. Others within earshot used this as an opportunity to abandon the mission too. Throughout the walk as well, the Stefano remained in sight, but as the crew closed in on it, the ship seemed to just move farther away. This prompted another handful of crewmen to also use this as justification to head back. Then another group used the increasingly bad weather as a reason to turn around too, so in total, 34 of the crew would turn back before ever reaching the Stefano. The rest of the crew continued on, but because they were so spread out, many of the men near the front didn't even know so many had turned back. Either way, thanks to the improved ice conditions on the second half of the trek and the Stefano eventually seeing them and closing the distance, the first of the Newfoundland crew arrived at the ship around 11:30 am, about 4.5 hours after they set off. As the crew came on board, Abram was there to personally welcome them and invite them inside for tea and bread, but because he was distracted, he didn't realize how exhausted they were. His focus was on his own ship's operations, and his much larger crew was split up on the ice floes all around the area. So while his demeanor was kind and warm, he couldn't hide how anxious he was to get back to his own work. Once all 132 remaining crewmen from the Newfoundland were aboard, Abram ordered the ship to the seal herd's last known location. About 20 minutes later, the Stefano came to a stop, and then Abram reappeared in front of the crew and ordered them to finish up their food and then return to the ice for the hunt. Now, here is where the first of a series of mistakes was made that would have catastrophic consequences. The night before, Abram's first officer also estimated the distance between the two ships to be between 5 and 7 miles, and he told the captain that the walk should take the Newfoundland crew no more than 2.5 hours to reach them if Westbury ended up sending them. Unfortunately, no one with the Newfoundland crew told Abram or anyone else what time they'd actually left that morning. Based on when they got there, it was assumed that they left around 9 o'clock. Abram had no idea that they actually started walking 2 hours earlier than that when he ordered them off the ship after less than a half an hour break. However, the crew didn't argue, nor would they, considering who the order was coming from, so they finished their tea and started to filter back outside. When they reached the deck, though, they couldn't believe their eyes. When they boarded, the crew could easily spot the Newfoundland in the distance. By then, it looked like someone had wrapped a big white curtain around the entire ship. As this was happening, George met with Abram on deck to get his orders and also saw how much the storm had progressed, and for a fleeting moment even wondered if he should refuse the orders. He then turned to Abram and asked him what he thought the weather might do. In response, Abram told him that things would pass and there was nothing to worry about. And because of Abram's reputation and experience, George immediately trusted what he said to be true. During their discussion as well, Abram told George which direction to go and told him to collect 1,500 seal pelts before calling it a day. He also told him that the area they'd be going was about 2 miles closer to the Newfoundland than where they were. Because of this, he also told George to just head back to the Newfoundland when their work was done instead of staying the night on the Stefano. After their conversation, George left the Stefano with the others and began to walk in the direction of the herd. After about 15 minutes of walking, Thomas met up with George to ask what Abram had told him, and George went on to explain how many pelts they were supposed to collect and then where to go after. Immediately, Thomas was taken aback by the instructions to return to the Newfoundland. Westbury had told Thomas the opposite. Unfortunately, before he could argue, they came upon the seal herd, so the men ended their conversation and got to work. Incredibly, only a few minutes into the job, conditions had gotten so bad so quickly that George gathered the officers to discuss what to do. And unanimously, due to the cold and whiteout conditions, they decided to abandon the mission and return to the Newfoundland immediately. Even though it was just after noon, some of the crewmen were already in bad shape because of how unprepared they were for the weather they were caught in. Sealing being the physical work it is, seal hunters were notorious for underdressing and traveling light. With how comfortable morning temperatures had been, many of the men didn't even wear coats or hats, and those who fell through the ice on the walk to the Stefano were already visibly shivering. This meant that everyone was either exhausted, cold, soaking wet, or some combination of the three. Seal hunters also rarely brought food with them, so in addition to everything else, the men were hungry. Unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot George could do about it other than try to get them back to the Newfoundland as quickly as possible. Before they set off, George met with Thomas again and asked him to lead the group in a southeasterly direction. Visibility was near zero, so rather than navigate back to the ship by sight, Thomas would have to rely on his compass. Based on where Abram had told them they were, heading southeast would bring them to the path they took to reach the Stefano that morning. Once they got there, George estimated they'd be about 1.5 miles away from the Newfoundland, and all they'd need to do was follow the path until they reached it. George then walked to the back of the group to help anyone who was walking slower and ensure no one was left behind. But what George didn't know was that they were not where he thought they were. Abram had made a mistake calculating their position. After almost 3 hours of walking to the southeast, finally the men got to the trail they were on that morning. They knew that's where they were because there was a flag belonging to the Stefano that was fixed into the ice to mark several seal pelts. When George got to the intersection though, something wasn't right to him. He realized the flag they stumbled on was the path, but this was 1.5 miles from the Stefano, not the Newfoundland. That meant they were at least 3.5 miles away from the Newfoundland still. But although this was frustrating, they had no other option, so George told Thomas to just keep going. By this point, everyone was beginning to walk a little slower, but then all of a sudden, they heard the sound of a blaring ship whistle, which they recognized as the Newfoundland. When the whistle went silent, the men screamed as loudly as they could, hoping that their ship would hear them and continue blowing the whistle so they could use the sound to guide them back. This was standard practice in low visibility, but after the whistle blew again 5 minutes later, that was the last time they heard it. This is likely because everyone in the Newfoundland was under the impression that the crew was safe on the Stefano, as they had agreed. In fact, it's unclear why it was even sounded in the first place. However, at the very least, hearing it those couple of times confirmed they were heading in the right direction. As if things couldn't get any worse, as the walk continued and the sun was setting, Thomas lost the path. So, completely off course in the dark, with the snow falling heavily, George had to consider whether it was better to stop for the night or keep going. Horrifyingly, no matter what he decided, men would die. Continuing on meant that they'd have to walk for miles, in the dark, on the ice, where men would fall through into the water. On the other hand, staying the night on the ice meant that some of the men wouldn't wake up in the morning. This meant he had to decide between some of his men drowning or some of his men simply not waking up in the morning. He eventually decided to stop for the night rather than risk the ice. The crew then split into 3 groups and made preparations for the night. Shelters were then built from loose pieces of ice and fires were lit using ropes and flags. Before long, the ice was quiet and the crewmen were fast asleep. A little while later, the winds changed direction and the snow turned to freezing rain. Since some of the men built up only one side of their shelter to block the wind, and none of them were able to build a roof with what little they had, the men were pelted with freezing rain afterward. At first light on April 1st, the crewmen who made it through the night began to wake up. Those who were awake huddled together for warmth while they kept their eyes on the ice shelters scattered around them. Each time someone got up and joined them, there was a slight sense of relief, but as the minutes went by, the men stopped waking up. The others went around and checked each of the shelters, but none of the men still inside were just sleeping. George didn't even need a head count to know that things were far worse than he imagined. Overnight, almost half the crew had frozen to death. And unfortunately, there was no time to let it sink in. George then had the men gather the bodies for the Newfoundland to pick up later. When the dead were stacked together, the remaining crew turned and continued their walk. The freezing rain overnight turned back into snow in the morning, so George and Thomas had to go right back to relying on a compass. However, thankfully, for the first time since they left the ship the previous morning, the crew finally had some good luck. During the early afternoon, the snow slowed and then stopped altogether. Because of this, George expected to see the ship when visibility improved, but the only ship any of them could see was the SS Bellaventure. This was another sealing ship that was back to work now that the weather cleared. And this ship was about 2 miles to the northwest, so back in the direction they had just come. George was sure that the Newfoundland was further to the southeast, but because it was far enough it was out of sight, he had no choice but to try to make it to the Bellaventure instead. When they were within a mile of this new ship, excitement began to grow among the crew. The night spent on the ice was sort of the opposite of restful, and the men didn't have much left physically or mentally. This temporary boost of energy was just enough to get them the rest of the way to the ship, and then, when the Bellaventure started steaming toward the crowd of men on the ice, the relief was overwhelming. They were saved. With a quarter mile between the men and the ship, they could see the crew of the Bellaventure busy at work loading seals onto the deck. Then, a moment later, the ship's crew was back on board, and then, unbelievably, the Bellaventure began to move away from them. The men waved their hands and shouted to get the attention of the crew they could clearly see on the deck, but between their focus on their work and the sound of the ship's engine, the crew on the ship never saw the crew on the ice. Had the Newfoundland crew been spotted, they would have been aboard the Bellaventure within just 15 minutes. As you might imagine, this was devastating, and it seemed to be the last straw for many of the crewmen in the worst shape. While they turned back to the southeast, the delirium of hypothermia became apparent. There is a condition known as paradoxical undressing that occurs with advanced hypothermia. This is when physiological changes cause the person to feel extremely hot instead of extremely cold, and causes them to remove their clothing to cool down, or if there's a body of water nearby, to jump in it to cool down. So as they continued, every so often, the men would whip around when they heard the splash of a crewmate either jumping into the water intentionally or falling through accidentally. When it seemed all hope was lost, miraculously another ship came into view and it was heading directly toward them. As it got closer, they recognized it as the Stefano. Abram or one of his men must have spotted them. After the deflating ship setting a few hours earlier, the crewmen had another surge of energy seeing the Stefano heading in their direction. This time, they didn't even wait until the ship was close enough to start waving and screaming, but then, when the ship was less than a mile away, it turned. The panicked crew tried to wave harder and scream louder, but they realized the Stefano hadn't seen them after all. By then, the sun was setting and it was becoming clear they'd have to spend another night on the ice, during which more of the men would freeze and wouldn't wake up the following day. Between all the sightings and their worsening condition, the situation was as chaotic as it was hopeless. This was then only compounded by the fact that moments later, another ship was spotted, and because of everything going on, the men weren't even sure if they were hallucinating. But, sure enough, the ship really was there, and this time it was the Newfoundland. Unfortunately, George estimated that it was about 4 to 6 miles away. There was just no way the men could walk that far after all they'd been through, not to mention they'd once again have to cross a very dangerous stretch of ice. George thought about it and then walked over to meet with Thomas about what to do next, but it was immediately apparent that Thomas was in bad shape. During their conversation, he realized that this might be as far as many of the men could go. Yet at the same time, it was more urgent than ever that he could get on any ship he could. It was then that he made a decision. Thomas and the men who could go no further would stay where they were for the night, while he led another group that was more fit to continue on. At most, he figured it would take the smaller group no more than 4 hours to reach the Newfoundland. Once they got there, they'd immediately return to rescue the others. George then announced the plan to the remaining men and asked those who were willing and able to join him. He expected about half of them to stay and half of them to continue walking, but only 9 other men stepped forward. This was bad. If more than 50 men were in such bad shape that another night on the ice felt like a better option than being on the Newfoundland in a few hours, things were worse than he thought. Either way, once the men were ready, they set off once again across the ice. The first part of the walk went faster than George expected, but he knew the pace would slow down once the ice changed again. At the midway point, they took their first steps onto the more treacherous section of ice. Every so often, George would look up to use the Newfoundland's position as a visual guide. Then, after a few rounds of this, George lifted his eyes, and to his horror, the Newfoundland was no longer directly in front of him. Throughout that same afternoon, Westbury kept watching the bridge and was uncharacteristically anxious about the status of his crew. The men hadn't returned in the hours after the storm dissipated, and then when night fell, his concern shifted to pure dread. He was completely helpless to do anything about it. His ship was still stuck, and there was no way of contacting any other ship. As he waited, hoping to see anyone coming across the ice, the only thing he could do was constantly push his ship to break free. Him and his crew tried in vain for hours to get the Newfoundland free until finally they heard a sharp cracking sound sometime in the middle of the night. Suddenly, the engine wasn't just spinning in place, the ship was finally moving for the first time in 3 days. When it was finally out, they steamed off toward the last known location of the crew. Unfortunately, the small group of men led by George was just 30 minutes from boarding the ship when they watched it steam away into the distance. Back on the ice with the group waiting, the men didn't even have to wait until morning to start counting bodies. Before many of them had even laid down for the night, several more had died. The men who were in better shape carried the bodies as they found them and stacked them in one spot like they had done that morning. Horrifyingly, because they were certain he wouldn't make it through the night, the crew stacked the bodies around Thomas, who was one of the few unconscious men still alive at the time. Then, as if 3 devastating moments believing they were saved wasn't enough, the Belle Venture once again came into view. Regardless, they tried getting the attention of the ship's crew, either those aboard the ship or the ones waiting on the ice to be picked up after their hunt. As they screamed, the air around them began to cloud up. The Belle Venture was actually so close to them, the smoke billowing out of its stacks was being blown by the wind directly at the Newfoundland crew, and this obscured them from sight. So once again, when the crew were aboard, the Belle Venture turned and steamed away. At first light the following morning, with his group of 9, George immediately got up and looked around for any ship in sight and saw 2. One was the Belle Venture, which had only moved to spend the night in a better position for the next day's work. The other was the Newfoundland, which was again somewhere between 4 and 6 miles away. He was also relieved to see that all 9 men with him made it through the night, but by then, 7 men didn't feel like they could go any further. George then noted their location and then set off with the other 2 toward the Newfoundland. A little while later, the 7 men who stayed behind noticed that the Belle Venture was much closer than where it was when they woke up, and it wasn't nearly as far as the Newfoundland. Because of this, 2 of them felt like they had just enough energy to reach it, so they headed off in that direction. So as a quick recap, because I know there are a lot of moving pieces, by this point there were 5 groups. The first are the ones that passed away on the first night that were left on the ice. The second are those that stayed behind with Thomas after they couldn't go any further. Then there is George's group of 9, which splintered into a further 3 groups. From these 3, the first are once again the ones that couldn't go any further. Then there is George and 2 others heading toward the Newfoundland, and the final group is a group of 2 heading toward the Belle Venture because it got closer to them. In any case, later that morning, Abram stood on the bridge of his ship scanning the ice around him for seals or a group of his men to pick up. As he was doing this, the door to the wheelhouse flew open and the wireless operator rushed in and handed him a slip of paper. The captain looked down at it and almost immediately yelled an order to the wheelman to change course. The wheelman then spun the wheel as far as it would go and had the engine go full steam ahead. The slip of paper still in Abram's hand was a message from the Belle Venture requesting any ships in the area that could come help assist in the rescue of the stranded members of the Newfoundland's crew. Those final 2 men had actually managed to get to the Belle Venture. At the same time, aboard the Newfoundland, Westbury was almost a mirror image of his father, standing on the bridge while looking back and forth across the ice. Then he spotted 3 black dots in the distance. He raised his binoculars and immediately recognized George. Unfortunately, he couldn't risk moving toward them or the ship might get stuck, so he could only pace the deck as he waited for the 3 men. When they were finally aboard, George told Westbury exactly where 2 groups of men were left alive. There wasn't much the Newfoundland could do because of its poor ability to navigate the ice, but thankfully it wouldn't need to. The entire Belle Venture crew was already on the ice, armed with stretchers, food, and coffee. The Newfoundland crewmen who could do so walked aboard the Belle Venture under their own power, but many of them couldn't move due to severe frostbite on their legs. Soon after, the Stefano and another sealing ship, the SS Florizel, arrived to help load up the rest of the survivors. The ordeal was finally over after 54 hours. Then, once everyone alive was on board, the crews got to work loading the ships with the ones who passed away. Morbidly, because the ships were full, the bodies had to be stacked on the deck like seals waiting to be stowed in the hull. As this was happening, back in St. John's, panic had broken out. The Belle Venture sent word of the tragedy intended for the hospital so they could prepare, but news leaked and spread throughout the city. On April 3rd, the entire city had to effectively shut down because thousands of people flooded telegraph offices and crowds blocked the streets waiting for any updates from the Belle Venture. The following day, those same thousands that crowded the streets the day before were at the harbor waiting for the first sight of the ships. When they were close enough, the entire crowd broke out in hysterics. Still on the bow was a tall and obvious stack of corpses. Tragically, this is how some of the family members of the deceased men learned the fate of their loved ones. When the ship was docked, it took several hours for each of the survivors to carefully be taken off the ship and transported to the hospital. In all, only 55 of the 132 men that made it to the Stefano on March 31st lived to make it back, and one of them would pass away in the hospital days later putting the death toll at 78. As if by fate, at the exact same time the crew of the Newfoundland was fighting for their lives, another ship, the SS Southern Cross, amplified the tragedy. It was loaded with more than 35,000 seal pellets, which is believed to have been more than it could handle, and it sank, taking all 174 men to the bottom of the ocean. All told, St. John's lost 251 men in the first days of April 1914. When the rest arrived at the hospital, the battle for some of them was far from over. Every single one of the 55 men who returned on the Belleventure suffered from extensive injuries that were either life-threatening or life-altering. Nearly all of them needed to have a limb or appendage amputated due to frostbite, like Thomas, who would lose both of his legs. George was one of the very few who came back in relatively good physical condition, but he had another battle that was just getting started. When the dust settled, Newfoundland formed a committee to investigate the disaster. Since no one survived on the Southern Cross, many of the details of its sinking are still a mystery to this day, and it also caused the Newfoundland to be the sole focus of the inquiry. After several months of interviews, the Commission's report was released, and it was damning for George, Westbury, and Abram. They did manage to avoid criminal charges because there was no singular cause named by the report, but there was still a lot of blame to go around. The report went on to detail inconsistencies in each of their accounts of those 4 days in the North Atlantic. Westbury claimed he instructed George to take shelter with the Stefano for the night, but George testified that he didn't recall being told that. He said his orders were to take the men to the Stefano and receive orders from Abram. George was also criticized for not refusing Abram's orders once he saw how bad the weather was, and the Commission found him guilty of poor judgment. Westbury was guilty of the same moral charge, but came out of the report a little more favorably. Because he had so little information at his disposal, the report noted the company that owned the ship set the captain up to fail. This left the brunt of the blame to be placed on Abram. He was found guilty of the same poor judgment, but the evidence to support the Commission's decision was much more extensive than it had against George and Westbury. In the end, the committee faulted Abram for 3 things. The first was sending the Newfoundland's men back onto the ice after only 20 minutes of rest. Second was sending them onto the ice at all given the conditions, and then finally for giving George the order to return to the Newfoundland after their work was done. But nothing damaged Abram's reputation more than his botched calculations for where the Stefano was going to drop the men off. Any experienced captain should know how to chart an accurate course, and this error set the disaster in motion since George made all his calculations based off the incorrect ones he received from Abram. Despite this, Abram would spend another 20 years in sealing, and he regained much of the respect he lost as a result of the disaster. He would go on to retire, having captured more than 1 million seal pellets. In the aftermath, the combined disasters of the Newfoundland and the Southern Cross sparked sweeping changes to the sealing industry in the British colonies and elsewhere, among many other regulations intended to improve crew safety. If you made it this far, thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Sean, and welcome to Scare Interesting. If you have a story suggestion, I'd love to hear it, and you can submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. This is Clipperton Island. It's just a small barren ring of coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. In the late 19th century, countries fought for ownership of it for a rare resource the island possessed. To stake their own claim, Mexico sent several families to colonize it, and supplies were regularly sent to keep them alive. Horrifyingly, at some point, these crucial supplies stopped coming, and once it was clear they'd been abandoned, one of these inhabitants revealed himself as a true monster. And this didn't have to do with the lack of food. This is their horrifying story. In the eastern Pacific Ocean, a small, unremarkable island sits barren and inhospitable, betraying very little of the atrocities that once took place on it. It's believed to have first been found by Spanish explorer Ferdinand Magellan in 1521, but the confirmed discovery of the island in 1711 is seen as the official one. That year, an English privateer named John Clipperton was sailing the Pacific attacking Spanish ships when he came across the tiny spot of land now known as Clipperton Island. At almost 3.5 square miles, or almost 9 square kilometers, this small landmass is made almost completely of coral in the shape of a ring, technically making it more of an atoll than an island. In the center of this ring is a stagnant freshwater lagoon of eutrophic water, meaning it contains an enriched mixture of minerals and nutrients. There aren't any fish or other sea life in this lagoon, however, because the only life it supports is algae. The water around the island is abundant with fish, but these are mostly some distance from the shore and the reef surrounding it. There are also hardly any plants there because only coconut trees and a few creeping plants seem to be hard enough to survive being rooted in coral. Poisonous crabs also infest the island. It's home to over a dozen species of seabirds, which use the island as a toilet more than anything, giving it a nauseating stench of ammonia. Then, beyond just how barren it is, Clipperton Island is about as remote as a place as there is, sitting almost 621 miles from the nearest land, which is the Mexican coast. It apparently once went by the name the Island of Passion, but has more often been described as a scab of an island. And considering what went on to take place there, there's no question which is more fitting. To understand Clipperton Island's most notable story and how it came to be, it's important to understand what led to it. For more than 100 years, the island was in contention between France, Mexico, Britain, and the United States. At points throughout its history, the four countries claimed ownership of it from one another to claim the island's most precious resource, which was surprisingly guano. Guano is the waste product of bats and seabirds and was extremely valuable at the time, and Clipperton Island was covered in it. The reason guano was so valuable was that in 1804, while visiting Peru, a German geographer saw locals using it as a fertilizer for crops. Then, taking note of the excellent produce available there, the geographer sent a sample of guano back to Europe. And the result of this study was bigger and more bountiful harvests of fruits and vegetables, which sparked worldwide interest. The only problem was that there were so few places with an abundance of guano, and they all seemed to be small specks of land in the Pacific Ocean, making it rare and valuable. In fact, guano became so important that in 1856, the US Congress passed a bill called the Guano Islands Act, allowing businesses to seek out those places and claim them. As this was going on, and for more than 30 years to that point, Clipperton Island was considered Mexican territory. However, seeing the lucrative opportunity the island presented, the French Emperor Napoleon III ordered a naval unit to the island in 1858. Their instructions were to make landfall and read a proclamation to the few Mexican soldiers guarding it. And to the French, that's all it took to claim ownership of it, but strangely, and maybe partially due to the remoteness, they didn't really do anything with it. 30 years later, in the 1890s, a US company arrived under the authority granted by the Guano Islands Act to begin mining for it, which they did for several years. Then, in 1897, Mexico returned to Clipperton Island to reclaim it from the French and remove the American workers who were living there. Then, 2 years after that, the British also arrived with their own navy, which was considered the very best in the world at the time. Since Mexico owned it again and the country knew it couldn't defeat the British, Mexican officials negotiated a deal that would grant England permission to mine and export the precious guano. Several years later, in 1906, a 33-year-old Mexican military officer named Ramon Arnaud and 13 soldiers and their families arrived on the island. Their job was to set up a small colony on the island to prevent it from continuing to switch hands between countries. For Ramon, however, this wasn't a choice. He was sent to Clipperton Island as part of punishment for deserting his post just a few months after enlisting in the military. He had already spent 5 months in jail for this, but in 1906, due to his skill set, was sent to Clipperton Island as the island's prisoner and official governor. This was how he would finish out his sentence. Later that same year, the Mexican president ordered that a lighthouse be built on the island. Then, upon its completion, a man named Victoriano Alvarez was sent there to become its keeper. At the same time, the British were also doing their part to colonize the island. They built homes and figured out how to grow vegetables in the coral. Then, before long, the island was populated by around 100 men, women, and children from Mexico and Britain. This was unfortunately short-lived because the guano market then collapsed, causing the British company mining it to go bankrupt. By then, the secret is out to the world about guano, and the market was flooded with competition, which drove prices down. All of the British residents of Clipperton Island then returned home, with the exception of one family that was ordered to stay behind to keep an eye on things. Meanwhile, France and Mexico, who were still at odds over who the rightful owner was, agreed to place the island in arbitration, which is a procedure for settling disputes by bringing in a neutral third party to make a binding decision. The King of Italy was chosen to serve as the arbitrator, but then while he was going over the details to make an informed decision, the Mexican Revolution began in 1910. This meant the country's future was extremely uncertain and resources were diverted elsewhere. The inhabitants of the island had gotten used to a ship arriving with a fresh load of supplies every month or so, but in 1911, that ship suddenly stopped showing up. Unbeknownst to the residents of Clipperton Island, it was attacked and sunk by the Mexican resistance, and afterward, it seemed that a new one just never got sent. Thankfully, by then, with the British gone, the population of Clipperton Island was down to just 26 people, so there weren't nearly as many mouths to feed anymore. This allowed them to stretch their provisions further, but either way, it became clear at some point that they were on their own. And with no one from the outside world coming to the island anymore, they had no idea why the ship stopped coming or that the fate of their country was in jeopardy. After that, it wouldn't be all the way until 3 years later in 1914 that anyone would return to Clipperton. That year, by chance, an American ship wrecked nearby and its crew came ashore. A rescue vessel then arrived to pick them up, and officials on board met with Ramon. They let him know about the Mexican Revolution, which was by then 4 years in, and that World War I had recently begun. Because his country had its hands full with the revolution and supply ships were clearly not a high priority for what remained of the government, the captain of the American ship tried to convince Ramon and the others to join them. On the way back to America, it could drop them off in Mexico. This offer was a tempting one, and Ramon would have taken it if not for one thing. The reason he was on Clipperton Island at all was because he deserted his post. This meant he was faced with the potential consequences of doing it a second time. Being sent to Clipperton Island in the first place was bad enough, so after some thought, Ramon declined the offer, but he did at least send the one last British family back on the rescue ship. The Americans then left Ramon some much-needed supplies and reluctantly returned to the ship and left the island. Ramon had no way of knowing it at the time, but this decision to remain behind would have terrifying consequences that far surpassed any punishment he might have faced from the Mexican military. After the Americans left, the supplies were quickly used up and the vegetable garden the British had maintained died after no longer being cared for. This meant all the inhabitants had left was what the island could offer them, and that wasn't a whole lot. There were seabird eggs to eat, and sometimes they'd get lucky enough to snag one of the birds for a more filling meal, but their only consistent source of nourishment were the few coconuts the island produced, and surprisingly enough, pigs. At some point during its colonization, pigs were introduced to the island, and they seemed to flourish. Although the crabs on the island were toxic to humans because the algae they ate, the pigs seemed to thrive on these crabs. However, even though they had enough calories, it didn't take long without much food diversity to reach a dangerous level of malnourishment, which quickly led to scurvy. I think most people are vaguely aware that it's caused by too little vitamin C, but I think it's worth rehashing just how awful the symptoms are. The first sign is usually bleeding gums, and then sores form all over the body, open up, and don't heal. If the disease progresses enough, those afflicted literally bleed out and die, and that's exactly what was happening in the colony. But horrifyingly, 4 years of malnourishment and a struggle just to stay alive was nothing compared to what was about to come. By 1915, the remaining colonists were few and feeble. The lack of nutrients had taken a terrific toll on the population and the surviving inhabitants. They were gaunt and ill-looking, even if they hadn't come down with scurvy. The survivors also seemed to be suffering from hallucinations and delusions as a result of their lack of nourishment, which may have been what sparked the first devastating turn of events. As Ramon looked over the horizon one day, he spotted a ship, and it was the first any of them had seen since the previous year. Unfortunately, it wasn't close to the island or heading its direction, but Ramon saw it as their best opportunity to be saved. He then ran to grab the other 3 remaining soldiers from the initial 13, and after some convincing, they pulled a small boat they had into the water and got in. It did have a motor, but not nearly enough fuel to reach the ship, meaning they'd have to somehow catch up to a large vessel with a propeller bigger than the boat they'd be rowing in. This was obviously a fool's errand from the beginning, but Ramon was adamant. Now, there are 2 different accounts of what happened next, and it's unknown which, if either, is accurate. In the first scenario, the men paddled the boat out well beyond the island, only to discover there was no ship, meaning Ramon was possibly hallucinating. This was the last straw for the 3 men with Ramon, and they attacked him and tried to take his gun to shoot him, but in the scuffle, all 4 men fell overboard and drowned. The second account was that the men, in their weakened state, couldn't get past the abnormally strong tides and waves around the island, and their boat eventually capsized. In either scenario, the men's wives helplessly watched from the shore as the Pacific Ocean consumed each of them. Then, before they even had a chance to grieve, a massive storm that had been developing began to head for them. They didn't know it at the time, but this ended up being a full-blown hurricane. Ramon's wife, Alicia, told the remaining women and children to run to her house where they could take shelter in the basement. Alicia, who was 9 months pregnant, trailed behind them and thankfully made it to safety. But the stress of the moment was enough to send her into labor. So in the basement, in the middle of a hurricane, on the day she watched her husband drown in the ocean, Alicia gave birth to a baby boy without any painkillers or a doctor. When the storm finally passed, they emerged from the basement and saw the buildings of their colony in ruins. Homes were destroyed, and the few coconut-bearing trees had been knocked down by the wind. Then, as they surveyed the damage, they spotted Victoriano, the lighthouse keeper, walking toward them. For almost 10 years, he remained reclusive, spending his time either in the lighthouse or his hut nearby, which was separate from the rest of the colony. The settlers rarely saw him up to that point, but he was now the very last man on the island. Before he made his way over to them, Victoriano went through all the remains of each house with the exception of the governor's to gather up all the guns. When he was sure he had them all, he took them to the coastline and tossed all but one of them into the ocean. Then when he reached them, they could barely believe their ears as he proclaimed himself the King of Clipperton Island, and then proceeded to announce that each of the women was now his personal property. From that day forward, Victoriano spent almost 3 years mistreating and tormenting the women, truly treating them like his possessions. In addition to regular beatings, disobeying the king in any way would be subject to his depraved imagination. He also took turns choosing one of the women to live with him in his hut, where he could assault and torment her until he got bored. Then he'd choose another of the women, and this cycle went on the entire time, and it was always clear who he had his eye on next. Anytime he felt like it, he would approach the women, ensuring they were all together, and order one of them to his hut. On one occasion, he even went up to the gathered women and ordered a 15-year-old girl to live with him, which he had never done before. Horrifyingly, everyone knew what that meant. The girl refused, and her mother jumped in front of her to protect her, but it was no use. Right there, in front of the rest of the women, Victoriano killed both the mother and her daughter. This very real threat of punishment, both witnessed and experienced by the women, kept them from challenging him at all for the most part, with the exception of one woman. A 20-year-old named Tirza was outspoken in her hatred for Victoriano and openly defied him his wishes, even if this came with severe consequences. When it was just her and the other women, she'd even go on about how Victoriano needed to die in order for them to be safe again. On July 17, 1917, Tirza had been staying in Victoriano's hut for several days because unfortunately, no amount of defiance was enough to prevent that from happening when it was her turn. Later, while she was sitting with the other women, Tirza saw Victoriano walking up toward them in the distance near the lighthouse. She knew that this meant her time as his favorite was over and she was about to be replaced by one of the others. In the years since Ramon's death, Victoriano never once targeted Alicia. It's unknown why he spared her up until then, but it seems he had grown tired of the other women. So when he approached them, he looked right at Alicia and ordered her to be at his hut early the next morning. The group was stunned, and it was the final straw for Tirza. Even though she was slightly older than the rest, Alicia had been like a mother figure to the others, and Tirza wasn't about to let Victoriano lay a finger on her. After she watched him return to the lighthouse, she told the others they had to form a plan. They had talked about killing Victoriano for so long, but were too afraid to make an attempt because if they failed, the consequences could be a brutal end, possibly for all of them. However, after hearing that Alicia was next, all their fear turned to vengeance, and they came up with a plan they hoped would bring this long, awful nightmare to an end. The next morning, Victoriano spotted Alicia walking toward his hut like he ordered. That morning, he managed to catch a bird and was cooking it outside, and he seemed to be in a good mood, which was sickeningly for what was about to come. But that changed the moment he saw Tirza with Alicia. Before they even reached him, he started shouting at the women, scolding Alicia for not showing up alone. When they got near him, he continued shouting at Alicia, and the two began arguing. Tirza then slipped into the lighthouse and returned with a hammer in hand. Then she looked right at Alicia's eyes, and Alicia gave her a slight nod. Victoriano noticed this side glance and began to turn around, but as he did, Tirza lifted the hammer over her head and with both hands grasping the handle, struck Victoriano as hard as she could. Before he even knew what was happening, she lifted it again and did this a second time. As this was happening, Alicia's son, Ramon Jr., had been hiding on the other side of the hut. She then shouted at him to grab Victoriano's rifle from inside. Meanwhile, Victoriano somehow managed to get back to his feet, and as he tried to collect himself, scrambled for an axe laying on the ground. He then lunged at Alicia, but before he could reach her, Tirza delivered a final blow to Victoriano. He then fell to the ground just as Ramon Jr. came out of the lighthouse with the rifle. Victoriano cried out in pain as he lay wounded on the coral. Tirza then went into Victoriano's hut and returned with a knife. Then she straddled the so-called king and went into a frenzy until Victoriano was unrecognizable. Tirza then dropped the knife, and the women fell into each other's arms from exhaustion and relief as they both burst into tears. When they built up the strength to return back to the colony, the rest of the women saw that Tirza and Alicia were covered in blood. Immediately, without anyone saying a word, they all knew it was over. Victoriano was dead. Then, just as Tirza and Alicia had, the group cried and embraced at the realization. Then, even more incredibly, as they continued their celebration, Ramon Jr. shouted to his mother and pointed out toward the ocean. Coming right for the island was a U.S. Navy gunboat named the Yorktown. The ship was in that part of the ocean looking for German submarines, and they had gotten word that the Germans were establishing a submarine headquarters somewhere in the East Pacific, and the Yorktown believed Clipperton Island could be where it was located. When they got closer to the island, they were surprised and confused to see a handful of women and children waving their arms at them. Unfortunately, like other ships that attempted to visit Clipperton Island, they struggled to get close enough to it without running aground. It then circled the island, but couldn't find an inlet to safely make it the rest of the way. So instead, a small boat was lowered into the water and a few sailors hopped in, hoping to reach the women, but it just wasn't happening. The tide was too strong and the coral was too close to the surface. The small boat then returned to the Yorktown, and suddenly, it too turned around and disappeared, apparently giving up on getting to the island. By then, the women had already been through enough that day already. They'd managed to liberate themselves from a vicious, self-proclaimed king, and were so close to being rescued, but the island itself was now not allowing it. Thankfully, as they sat there in a stunned silence, the Yorktown reappeared and closed the distance to the island. This time, it found a route through the coral and then right close to the shore. Alicia then stood up and ran frantically to the crew and explained everything all at once. Still in shock of even finding people there, the crew listened in absolute horror as Alicia communicated the atrocities that took place there. The crewmen then managed to calm Alicia and the rest of the women down and asked what they needed to get from the colony before leaving. Then, several of the men accompanied them to these still damaged houses. Others went to find Victoriano's body, and after hearing about what he did, they simply left his body where it was for the crabs to eat. Not long after, the Yorktown and the 11 survivors of Clipperton Island set off towards Salina Cruz, Mexico. Each of the women had relatives there who could take them in and help them get accustomed to a very different life than the one they'd lived in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The Yorktown also sent a wireless message back to Salina Cruz to inform the city of the situation and asked them if they reach out to those family members so they could be there when the ship pulled in. As they sailed, it was remarkable to the crewmen just how big a physical toll the island had taken on the women. Prior to learning her age, the captain believed Alicia was in her mid to late 40s, but she was just 29, and the rest of the women looked similar despite being younger than her. Even the children were gone, and one of them had rickets so bad he couldn't walk. But despite this, and even with some of the women suffering from seasickness on the ride home, there was nothing that could spoil their relief. The crew of the ship even spent the trip entertaining and playing with these 7 children so that the 4 women could finally get some solid rest for the first time in years. Apparently, over those 3 days, the crew and the children had such a good time that before arriving in Mexico, the crew got together and pooled together the money they had on board. They then presented it to the women to help them start a brand new life. The Yorktown finally pulled into Salina Cruz on July 22, 1917, to a large gathering of people, many of whom had been waiting for the women for years. Among them was Alicia's father, who spent the previous 7 years badgering the Mexican authorities every chance he got about where his daughter was and what happened to her. Apparently, in every conversation he had with officials, they brushed him aside and told him all the colonists were dead. However, incredibly, when Alicia stepped off the ship and saw her father, she was also able to introduce him to his 4 grandchildren. After the rescue, the city threw a huge party for the Yorktown crew to show their appreciation for their kindness and heroism. In the months afterward, an official report would be written and turned into the US Navy for review, and to protect the women, the report omitted any mention of Victoriana for fear that including it could have negative consequences for Alicia and Tirza. For more than 17 years, not a single soul in the Yorktown uttered a word of the murder to anyone to keep the 2 women protected. It was only after they were sure there would be no repercussions that any of the crew or any of the women talked about Victoriano, his unspeakable cruelty, and his eventual killing. As for Clipperton Island, the King of Italy made a ruling on the ownership claims of France and Mexico in 1931, more than 20 years after it was signed into arbitration. In his decision, he awarded ownership to France, and Mexico didn't appeal the decision. Even still, Clipperton Island managed to keep itself in the headlines through much of the 20th century. In 1947, 5 American fishermen were rescued from the island 6 weeks after their ship sank. Then in 1962, the sinking of a tuna clipper left 9 crewmen stranded for 23 days. And obviously, both groups of men got just a taste of what the Clipperton Island colonists survived and barely escaped with their lives. Since then, there has never been any further attempt by any country to colonize the island. If you made it this far, thanks for tuning in. If you have a story suggestion, feel free. Imagine you were standing in knee-deep water on the shore of a small island, watching your ship and only salvation slowly disappearing over the horizon. And no matter how loud you screamed and how desperately you cried out, there was no chance of it coming back. Now imagine this island was remote, completely uninhabited, and in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Would you be able to survive? And if you were able to survive, how long do you think it'd take before you completely lost your sanity? This is the story of Alexander Selkirk and Massacheria Island. Alexander Selkirk had always been a bit of a loose cannon. Born in 1676 in Fife, Scotland, he was the son of a tanner, and as a kid he was known for his mischief and restlessness, and often got into trouble. His first run-in with the authorities was at 17 when he was charged with indecent conduct in a church. And a few years later, Alexander accidentally drank salt water. His younger brother found this funny and laughed at him, but rather than a normal reaction to some light teasing, Alexander attacked his brother and almost shot him before getting wrestled to the ground by some bystanders. This landed him back in court, or at least it would have if he had any intention of showing up. Some people think Alexander behaved the way he did because his mother was too easy on him. Alexander was her seventh son, and there was an old Scottish superstition that a seventh son was lucky. The seventh son was supposedly a man who could have special powers, like being able to see into the future, so no matter how strict his father's discipline was, his mom would always let him off in the belief that he was somehow gifted. And in fact, she wasn't entirely wrong. Alexander was one of the most intelligent kids in his school. He had a knack for problem solving and a talent specifically for the mathematics of navigation. Because of this, his mother often told him he'd be a great sailor. His father, on the other hand, didn't like the idea of his son leaving for a life in the ocean. His other sons had joined him in the tanning business, and he wanted the same for Alexander. To keep him from leaving, Alexander's father threatened to take him out of the will if he left. And this wasn't an idle threat. A tanner made a lot of money back then, and there was a large estate that was supposed to be shared between Alexander and his brothers. So, for a time, Alexander did as he was told and stayed home, but secretly, he always wanted to see the world, and he was just waiting for an excuse to leave. When his behavior finally landed him in trouble with the church authorities again, he decided that this might be the perfect time to set off and pursue his true calling, regardless if he got his inheritance or not. And thankfully, the same restless energy and thirst for adventure that got him into trouble followed him into his new career. Alexander being Alexander, instead of joining the Navy or becoming a merchant, he joined up with pirates and buccaneers based in the South Seas. For a time, he was essentially a real-life pirate of the Caribbean, and during which he built a reputation as an excellent navigator. After doing that for a couple of years, he joined the crew of Captain William Dampier in 1703 as a privateer. Being a pirate had been exciting, but it was also dangerous, so Alexander wanted to pivot to something similar but with a little less risk. Ironically enough, a privateer is basically still a pirate. They were just sponsored by the English crown instead of operating independently. Now, in 1703, England was at war with Spain, so any ships that could damage lines and hinder the Spanish Navy would get a commission from the British Navy. This gave them not only the permission to attack Spanish ships, but also a reward for doing so. Under his command, Captain William had two ships. The lead ship was the St. George, which was captained by William himself. Alexander got the position of sailing master on the other ship in his command, which was known as the Cinque Ports. This put Alexander in charge of all of the navigation. Not long into Alexander's time with the crew, the captain of the Cinque Ports died from scurvy. This meant that the role of captain then went to the first officer, Lieutenant Thomas Stradley. Unfortunately, while William and the old captain got along incredibly well, William and Thomas were not so friendly with one another. In fact, not long after Thomas had taken over, 3/4 of his crew almost mutinied after a disagreement with their new captain. Then, in addition to the old captain's death and the new command, the whole crew just generally had a tough year. In one instance, they fought with a French warship but weren't able to sink it or capture it before it escaped. This meant that it then went on to inform the enemy navies who they were and that they were hostile, completely destroying any surprise they had. So from then on, the whole Spanish Navy knew who they were, and that meant they were both the hunter and the hunted. This raised tensions further between the crew and captains and later resulted in several close calls with enemy ships and the deaths of many of the crew. And tensions would only escalate from there, especially between Captain William and Captain Thomas. The following year, in 1704, on one of their regular missions, Captain William planned to attack a Spanish gold mining town up the Santa Maria River in Panama. Before they reached their goal, though, they were ambushed by the Spanish due to a series of mistakes by William. Then, while the ambush was happening, William panicked and called for retreat instead of fighting. In response, Captain Thomas was furious and blamed William for wasting time, resources, and lives. He then went on to tell William that he'd made too many mistakes and wasn't capable of leading both ships anymore. At this point, it was seeming inevitable that Thomas and William would eventually have a full-blown disagreement. On May 18th, they spotted a small boat and managed to capture it with almost no resistance. It was a merchant ship loaded with supplies and a little bit of money, and Thomas wanted to keep it after finding out that there was a significant amount on board. William, on the other hand, didn't believe the story and cut the boat loose before it could be searched. Thomas, again, was livid, and a massive argument broke out between the two captains. By then, Thomas had finally had enough, and he broke the partnership, and the two ships sailed in separate directions. Alexander ultimately decided to stay with Thomas. He had seen the mistakes that William had continued to make, and so although he knew Thomas was inexperienced, he realized Thomas was the better option. After separating, and inexperienced as he was, Thomas knew his ship needed repairs. The last few months had been tough on the Cinque Ports. Even the capture of the merchant ship, though surprisingly easy, had taken a toll on its hull. So in August, they dropped their anchor by the island of Masatiera, 460 miles off the coast of Chile, and started to patch up the boat. Although this island is small and mountainous, it's forested just enough to have provided any wood the crew needed. At that time as well, the island was completely uninhabited and was one of the few islands in the region not populated by Polynesians. And this was likely because of how remote it is. If you look at a map, you can hardly even tell it's there. There are also no others in the area for hundreds of miles in every direction. It's just this little speck in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. While they stopped at the island, Alexander wasn't happy with the captain's repairs. The Cinque Ports was in really rough shape and riddled with shipworms eating their way through the hull. All Thomas was doing was basically patchwork, but the ship needed proper protection around the hull or it would leak. He'd said this to William before, and just like William, Thomas didn't want to hear about it. Doing that sort of repair would take too long, and he and his men were eager to get back on the sea trying to make money. Alexander and Thomas kept arguing until Alexander packed his essentials into a boat and told his captain he would rather wait on the island than sail on a dangerous ship. He was then rowed to the shore by some of his colleagues. Then he shook their hands and said goodbye, waiting for Thomas to break and agree to some proper repairs. But Thomas didn't break. He stood on the ship, watching Alexander being rowed to the beach. When his shipmates turned around to row back, Thomas didn't even flinch. Instead, he told them to ignore Alexander no matter what he said. When Alexander finally realized that Thomas wasn't bluffing about leaving him behind, he panicked. He rushed into the water and pleaded to be let back on board, but not only did Thomas stay firm, but he also started to mock Alexander. He told Alexander that what he had done was mutiny and that being left behind was the right thing to do. Thomas had had enough of his crew talking back to him and making things difficult. This time, Captain William wasn't around to save him. Alexander would be left on the island and be an example to the others. So, the Cinque Ports began to sail away, and Alexander was officially marooned. The only fortunate thing about the entire situation was that to make his threat seem real, Alexander had brought a chest containing some supplies. In it was bedding and a few changes of clothes, a rifle with some powder and bullets, a hatchet, a knife, and a small kettle. And thinking he might have to hold out for a while before Thomas broke, he brought his Bible, some tobacco, a few navigational instruments, and his book on navigation to pass the time. Unfortunately, despite having these supplies, it didn't really lessen the impact of being marooned. In fact, at first he couldn't even believe it. He was sure that Thomas would realize he was right and then turn back to pick him up. He even sat on his chest of belongings, staring out to sea for days, hardly eating or sleeping. Then, once he was hungry enough, he just wandered the shore, catching shellfish and eating fish that had washed up. For a while, he stuck to the beach because he didn't think it would be long before someone sailed by, and he didn't want to miss them. But eventually, the days turned to weeks, and then the weeks turned to months. By October, it was spring in the southern hemisphere, but Alexander hadn't noticed the flowers that had begun to bloom around him. These first few months were an incredibly dark time for him. He'd spent his life surrounded by people, either his big family back home or his extended family out on the ocean. But now, he was more isolated than almost anyone in history and finding it difficult to cope, and occasionally this led to some more sinister thoughts. But then after a while, he started to think differently. Alexander spent much of his early youth in the church, and it still mattered to him despite the trouble he sometimes caused. His faith helped him again during this time on the island. He thought to himself that he could have been abandoned anywhere, but instead of somewhere desolate, believed that God had left him on an island with all the resources he might need to survive. Reframing it like that helped him to start to feel better about his situation. For about 9 months, he stuck to the beach, getting used to a diet of seafood and seals. During the fall, though, the beach on that side of the island becomes a mating ground for thousands of sea lions. When that happens, they can become aggressive if you get too close, and they take up so much room on the beach it's hard to avoid them. They're also far too big for any human to tackle on their own. On top of this, it was starting to get colder. Winter was on the way, and Massachusetts can drop to 48 degrees Fahrenheit or 9 degrees Celsius and can get quite frosty at that time of the year. It also starts to rain more often, and sometimes it can even snow at higher elevations. Finally, Alexander realized that he needed to build a shelter, so he moved into the forest for the first time. Then he found some pimento trees and used the tools he had to cut them down and turn them to a hut to sleep in. He also found some tall grass at the edge of the hills in the area and cut that down and dried it out until it was like straw. Then he used that to thatch a roof for the hut, and after the hut was constructed, he used some more pimento trees to make a bed and covered it with the bedding he brought. This hut worked to keep the cold and rain away, but it didn't stop the rats. Whenever Alexander tried to sleep in his new bed, he was woken up by little bites all around his body. He tried a few different ways to keep the rats out so he'd get a good night's sleep, like reinforcing the bottom of a shelter and trying to cover the floor with something they couldn't chew through, but nothing worked. Then he had an idea. The rats weren't native to the island. They had been brought there by ships that anchored off the coast looking for supplies. For as long as humans have sailed, they've had a problem with rats on ships, but they also had a way to keep their numbers down, and this was done by using cats. Incredibly, there were also hundreds of feral cats on the island who'd gotten there the same way. If he could capture and tame some of them, he might be able to keep the rats away from his hut. Soon enough, he managed to find some kittens from a recently pregnant cat and he started to raise them himself. It didn't take long before they started catching rats and any other vermin that tried to get into his huts. It meant sacrificing some of the meat he caught, but that was easily worth it for a good night's sleep. From then on, he kept himself occupied by teaching his cats tricks and even teaching them how to dance. Before long, he also found out that they bred so quickly that they filled the hut he slept in, which Alexander actually didn't mind because he liked the company. Once he could finally sleep at night, he got into the habit of reciting one of the Psalms from his Bible every morning when he woke up and every night before bed. He found it grounded him, helped keep the depression at bay, and let him practice speaking, which was something he hadn't been doing at all since being left alone. Later, he built a second hut a little away from the big one and used that as a kitchen to prepare any animals he caught. Then he found some wood that was fire resistant and used it to build a spit to cook on. Thankfully for him, starting a fire was easy. He'd been taught as a kid how to start a fire by rubbing two pieces of wood together. This also meant that the kettle he brought with him was one of his most important tools. He used that to boil the meat, which then made butchering his food easier. And after the success with the cats, Alexander even managed to tame some wild goats. He kept them just outside his kitchen hut, and they were a backup in case he hurt himself and couldn't hunt, and he even used them for milk. The goats he ate most often, though, were the wild goats that he chased down on foot. These were his main source of food, but incredibly, they weren't also all he ate. On the island were vegetables like pimento peppers and a type of parsnip. He also foraged for radishes and watercress and experimented with fruit and vegetables that were native to the island. He even found a thick cabbage palm that he could use like bread. Sometimes as a treat, he'd catch a large crayfish, boil it in the kettle, and then eat it with whatever vegetables he'd foraged for that day. After about 18 months, Alexander really began to settle into his new life on the island. He had plenty of food and he found a way to keep his mind occupied and stave off the hopelessness that he felt when he first got stranded. He was even happy on the island most of the time, and at some point even noticed the spring flowers as they bloomed. Over time as well, he got to know every inch of the area. He knew the safe spots and the dangerous spots, he knew which rock faces were safe to climb and which weren't. Ironically, exploring the island made him fitter than he'd ever been in his life. When he first got there, he could only catch younger goats. After a couple of years, he was fast and strong enough to go for the bigger ones. As often happens though, familiarity breeds complacency, and Alexander's overconfidence nearly killed him. One afternoon, he climbed halfway up a cliff about a mile from his kitchen hut as he was following a big adult goat. He hadn't realized how high he was because the tops of bushes obscured the drop, but then when he reached out to grab the goat, he lost his footing and fell back down the cliff onto his back. The fall left him winded and bruised and more than a little stunned, and he knew that a fall like that could have easily killed him. He probably only survived because the goat had landed first underneath him, breaking his fall. At the same time though, Alexander was still severely hurt and he lay there for days afterward, likely with some cracked ribs. Finally, after 2 or 3 days, the pain started to subside. He still couldn't move much, but he was able to crawl back to his hut, drink a little bit of water, and eat some of the meat he'd stored from an earlier hut. Then, after he's well again, Alexander thought about the fact that if he had died, there would have been nothing left of him. Something would have eventually found him and eaten him. He even worried that his cats might eat him if he died there, leaving nothing to bury if someone eventually came across his huts and wondered who'd made them. So, from that day forward, he started to cut his name and the date he was stranded on the trees around the island. It was the closest thing he could get to a tombstone if the worst were to ever happen. After living there for a few years, all of his original clothes and bedding were worn out and had big holes in them. Thankfully, he still has goats though, and he had the skills gained from years of working as a tanner. So he started skinning them and sewing their pelts together using strips of leather and a sharp needle he'd found in his navigation kit. When his bedding wore out, he used skins for blankets. He even made a short pair of pants, a jacket, and a hat to keep the sun off his head in the summer. He then took his old bed linen and turned it into new shirts. Over time though, even the tools he brought with him started to wear out, but incredibly though, he often found things on the beach he could use to replace them. On one occasion, he found 2 large metal hoops left by some ship that had anchored near the shore some point before he got there. He was then able to shape those and turn them into knives. It seemed as though every time he needed something, he was resourceful enough to come up with a solution. Unfortunately though, even though he was happier than you might expect living alone on an island, he was still lonely and missed his home in the company of other people. Every day, he'd look out for any sign of distant ships, hoping one might come ashore and rescue him. At the same time, it couldn't just be any ship. Getting caught by the Spanish would mean either death or worse. He might get sent to a prisoner of war camp to be used as slave labor in the brutal mines of Peru or Mexico. If he had a choice, it would have been far better to live out his life on the island instead. Then, a few years after he was stranded, it finally happened. A ship finally dropped anchor in the water near the island and sent a boat to the beach. Because it was far enough away, Alexander couldn't see what flag the ship was flying, so he crept down to find out who it was, and any hope of rescue disappeared when he realized they were Spanish. Then, when Alexander tried to sneak back, he must have made a noise because 2 musketball shots barely missed his head. He then took off back toward the safety huts and they chased him, firing random shots toward him whenever they could. As he ran, he found a tall tree, and after glancing back and realizing no one could see him, he climbed up to the top of it and held still. For a short while, the Spanish hunted for him around the base of the tree, but by some miracle, they couldn't find him and they didn't see his hut. They did see his small herd of goats though, and realizing it was too good an opportunity to miss, they shot a few to carry back to their boat. Once Alexander was sure they were gone, he climbed down the tree and returned to the safety of his hut and realized they were so close to finding his home. Had they gone just a little bit further, he might have had to start building another one elsewhere because they would have almost certainly destroyed it. Because of how close this encounter was, when another ship came to the island sometime later, Alexander decided it would be better to hide till they were gone. 4 years after Alexander was stranded, so now in 1708, Captain William had a new job. Since he had returned to England, he found it impossible to get command of his own ship anymore. News of his failures got there long before he did, so the best he could do was pilot on a privateer vessel called the Duke. The Duke's captain, Captain Woodes Rogers, knew William had years of experience even if his ability to command had been questionable. And eventually, William went on to sail back over the Atlantic with the Duke and its sister ship, the Duchess. Then in January of 1708, the Duke and Duchess approached none other than the island of Massachiera. They were low on supplies, and the island looked like a great place to stock up before they moved on, and William remembered that island. He remembered how 4 years ago his partner had betrayed him and sailed there to repair his boat. Ironically, after leaving the Cinque Ports, which was then captained by Thomas, managed to get to the coast of modern-day Colombia before it took on water and sank, just as Alexander had been worried about. The crew who survived were then picked up by the Spanish and imprisoned in Peru. Afterward, they lived out their lives under the kind of conditions that Alexander would have stayed on his island forever to avoid. In any case, as they approached Massachiera, William's captain had his pilot stop some way out from the island and drop anchor. He decided to start by figuring out what supplies they needed, and then in the morning they'd head to shore to gather them. Later that night, someone on one of the boats spotted a fire that looked like it was on the shore. In the pitch darkness, they couldn't really see exactly where though. It could have been on the beach, but it also could have been between them and the island. And if it wasn't on the beach, it could have been on a ship also anchored close by, and they didn't want to risk letting a French or Spanish vessel know they were there. So they decided not to respond and just stay as quiet and as dark as they could. When morning came though, it was clear it wasn't on another boat. Someone had lit a fire on shore. At noon that day, they sent a small crew over to find out what was happening. Then as they got closer, they heard cries and saw a man running toward them across the beach. He had a long beard and was dressed like a wild animal, his legs were naked and without shoes, and he was carrying a small white flag. The day before, Alexander had spotted the two ships in the distance. Then, after making sure they couldn't see him, he crept closer while trying to figure out where they were going and, more importantly, where they'd come from. He eventually realized they were coming straight toward the island and they flew the English flag. Right away, he couldn't contain his excitement and he cheered and shouted because of how happy he was. He was finally going to be rescued. When they anchored off the coast, Alexander realized they wouldn't be able to see him from where they were and he had to find a way to signal them. So he gathered as much wood as he could, piled it onto the beach, and then spent the day sitting in the same spot where he started his life on the island. Then he just stared out at the sea, waiting for a small boat to come for him. When no one had come in the daylight, he shaped the wood into a beacon and lit it on fire. Then he stayed awake all night to make sure it kept burning. He even also killed and prepared some goats. He knew that if they did find them, they'd be hungry. With a journey that long across the ocean, they were sure to be down to their final rations. Some proper, well-cooked meat would be an excellent welcome to his island. By morning, they still hadn't come, but he was sure they couldn't ignore the fire for long. He just had to be patient. Then, finally at noon, he spotted the boats heading toward him. When they got close enough to spot him, he rushed to the shore and screamed at them. Then they rowed toward him, stepped into the beach, and then Alexander immediately ran toward them and embraced them. Incredibly, in those first few moments, he was actually finding it hard to speak. He hadn't spoken to a human for so long that despite the daily practice of the Psalms and conversations with his pets, he found it hard to string complete sentences together. Eventually, he managed to be understood well enough to invite them back to see his hut to feed them as he had planned. Then, once he'd shown them his hut, he gathered up as much of his prepared goat as possible and returned to the Duchess. This is when he saw a familiar face and realized it was William. But if William was on board, Alexander didn't want to be. His last memories of William and his poor command made it preferable to actually stay on Massachiera if he was in charge. It wasn't until the captain finally explained what had happened when William reached England that Alexander agreed to climb on board. Ironically, the feeling wasn't mutual. William told his captain that Alexander was the finest crew member on board the Cinque Ports. Afterward, the two ships stayed anchored off the coast for 10 days, refitting and repairing their hulls while adding more supplies. Alexander spent this time hunting for them, ensuring they ate better and helping them to avoid the rations they had left on the ship. He knew he'd have to eat the rations at some point on the journey home, but he wanted to put that day off for as long as possible. He was given some fresh clothes and a pair of shoes to wear, and funny enough, after years in bare feet, they just made him clumsy at first. Then when they left, the captain was impressed by how relaxed Alexander was. The years on the island had given him incredible patience. He never swore or lost his temper, and if problems arose, he tackled them calmly and head-on. The captain was also extremely impressed with his navigation skills. Not only did Alexander remember what he knew before, but because the only thing he had to read besides the Bible were navigation manuals, he was more skilled than ever. The captain then decided to make Alexander his second mate, which technically meant he outranked William. Following his whole ordeal, Alexander went straight back into the world of privateering as if he never left, and spent the next 4 years at sea causing the Spanish as much trouble as possible, until finally reaching England on October 1st, 1711, 8 years after Thomas originally abandoned him. During this fruitful time on the Duke, he amassed a wealth of $800, or roughly several $100,000 US today. William, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. The owner of the St. George and the Cinque Ports sued him for the damage to the ships. Compared to Thomas, though, William got off lightly. William was in debt and branded a failure, but at least he was alive and not mining coal in the worst conditions imaginable. Even so, he died a broken man in 1715. Later on, Alexander was never entirely comfortable with his life back in England. Despite trying to settle down and marry, in 1717 he was back out on the sea, this time as a member of the Royal Navy. He even became an officer as part of an anti-piracy control, with his expertise on the other side of piracy being invaluable. Then, tragically, while on patrol off the coast of Africa, he contracted yellow fever and died on December 13, 1721. In his years after leaving Massachusetts, and despite how hopeless those first months had been, he looked back fondly on his time on the island. This was so much so that apparently he even once said, "I am now worth 800 pounds, but shall never be as happy as when I was not worth a farthing." Hello everyone, and welcome to Scary Interesting. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you're new here and you want to see more content just like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of the weekly videos. Thank you all so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.
Gunfights, train wrecks, and gold. That's what you'd find at this small...
This is a painting by Theodore Jericho known as the Raft of Medusa. It depicts a grisly scene of people desperately hanging onto a raft as mountain-sized waves roll in to throw them into the ocean. Jericho was inspired to paint this after hearing the true story of the French frigate Medusa. But despite the vivid images, it doesn't come close to how horrifying the actual events were. This is the true story of the Raft of Medusa. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Quickly, before we get into the video, I want to introduce you to today's sponsor, Factor. Factor is a meal delivery service that delivers fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep. But what I think is the best part about Factor is that there's no prep required. The meals are ready to go in literally 2 minutes. You may remember when I worked with HelloFresh a few months ago, and now HelloFresh owns Factor. As much as I love HelloFresh, there are times when I'm super busy running around or with work, or more recently, busy with summertime activities where I don't have time for all the prep, cooking, and cleanup. With Factor, I can still get delicious, never frozen meals in a fraction of the time. This even allows me to switch between brands depending on what my schedule is looking like and enjoy an even wider range of recipes. Factor alone has over 34 delicious recipes weekly to choose from. There are even meals like grain bowls and salad toppers that are ready to eat without a microwave, which is perfect for when you're out and about. So, if you're like me and you want convenient, delicious, and nutritious meals ready in just 2 minutes, head over to factor75.com or click the link below and use code SCARY50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Once again, head on over to factor75.com or click the link below and use code SCARY50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. A couple of centuries ago, there was a strip of coast of West Africa that both the British and French were constantly fighting for control over. Between 1749 and 1816, the two empires fought to gain control over this area, which is now present-day Western Sahara, south all the way to the Gambia. And this fighting was seen as crucial to control the flow of minerals and other valuable assets from those shores. Eventually, to try to put an end to the bloodshed, in 1783 the two nations signed a treaty which was supposed to stop the fighting, but their armies mostly ignored it and continued attacking each other's positions. Over the next few decades, the battles continued and control of the region changed every few years. Finally, after Napoleon was defeated in 1815, the new French government ratified the treaty. In theory, who was allowed to do what on the West African coast was settled, and the fighting in that region stopped. In the years leading up to the treaty, much of that fighting had taken place at sea, and the legendary British Navy had for the most part established dominance. This obviously didn't stop the French from fighting back where they could, and their shipbuilders kept making ships that they hoped would be able to weaken the grip the British had on the seas. One of these ships was known as the Méduse, which was launched in 1810. Méduse was a big state-of-the-art 40-gun frigate with incredible firepower and surprising maneuverability. It was also fast, and so for the first 6 years of its life, it was used to lead raids on British positions on the African coast and across the Atlantic in the Caribbean. It was so quick, in fact, that whenever British ships tried to follow it, they'd struggle to keep up and then lose sight of it after a day or so. This speed and firepower also made Méduse an ideal ship to attack British convoys in the open ocean to capture British goods and take prisoners. Shortly after Napoleon lost at Waterloo, the French restored their monarchy, which meant that for the first time since the Revolution, the country's nobility controlled the armed forces again. The new King Louis XVIII decided to give one of his most loyal noblemen, a man named Hugues Viscount du Roy de Chameray, the rank of captain and put him in command of Méduse. This wasn't a popular choice because Hugues had hardly sailed in 20 years, and his appointment meant that other better officers were passed over. This was sort of seen as the king's friends taking up the position rather than more competent officers. But although the crew of Méduse didn't have much confidence in their new captain, they were well-disciplined seamen who knew they were supposed to take orders and not question them. On June 17, 1816, the new captain and Méduse set off from France en route to Senegal on the west coast of Africa. As part of the new treaty, the British were handing the port of St. Louis back to the French, and this was an important symbolic gesture that the new French royal family hoped would signal an end to the hostilities. The Méduse was the lead ship in a small convoy made up of several other ships, and because of the significance of this convoy, the Méduse had a lot of important dignitaries on board, including the new governor of Senegal and his wife and their staff. On top of that, in addition to its usual 160 crew members, it carried several hundred infantrymen who were supposed to be stationed at the port. Right from the start of the trip, and due to a serious lack of wind, the first part of the trip from France to the island of Madeira off the African coast was a bit of a struggle. Occasionally, the wind would pick up, giving the boat some speed, but most of the time there was almost nothing. When the wind died down completely, the smaller boats in the convoy found it difficult to travel at all against the tide. Eventually, two of the ships fell behind and set off on a different course they hoped would have better conditions, leaving the Méduse and another ship known as the Echo to continue alone. A little while later, as the two ships continued their journey to Madeira, one of the young crew members lost his footing and fell through a porthole. He managed to grab a rope as he fell, but because Méduse was moving quickly with full sail, the cord was torn from his hands and he fell into the ocean. The crew knew that the Echo was behind them, so they fired a gunshot to let them know a man was overboard and threw a life buoy out to him. Thankfully, the boy was a strong swimmer and he managed to reach it and climb in, but because he was so far out in the ocean and so small, the Echo missed him and he was never seen again. This was later seen as a bad omen for what was to come. Now, the journey from Madeira to Senegal can be a dangerous one if you don't navigate it properly. The obvious and fastest route is to head straight for the African coast and follow it around. The problem is that if you sail too close to the shore in that part of the water, you risk hitting hidden sandbanks and reefs that are just under the surface. So instead, most ships take the slower route further out the Atlantic. Unfortunately, the new governor wanted to reach St. Louis to begin work as fast as possible, and he asked the captain to plot as direct a course as he could to cut down on time. A more experienced captain might have refused, but Hugues was out to impress people on his maiden voyage. So, with the wind finally behind them, the captain ordered his men to set full sail and head straight for the African coast. For some reason that no one's ever been able to understand, and maybe it's just one of those facts that was lost to time, Hugues asked one of his passengers to help navigate the ship. As they got closer to the dangerous African coast, this passenger told the crew he'd spotted the Cape Blanco Peninsula ahead of them, which is an important landmark. Hugues then ordered a ship to turn and stay close to the African coast while avoiding one of the most dangerous reefs in the era, known as the Bank of Arguin. As they were doing this, the crew of Méduse noticed that the Echo had hung a lantern to try to attract their attention. Unfortunately, the watchman on duty didn't know what this message could be and couldn't see any danger, so he just hung a lantern out for a short time to let the Echo know he'd seen their message. Then, a little while later, they realized that the Echo had changed course and was sailing at an angle away from them. On the open ocean, you can see about 18 miles into the distance from the deck of a ship like Méduse, so when they couldn't see the Echo the following morning, they knew it had traveled at least that far away. This started to worry some of the officers, and eventually one of them, a man named Lieutenant Maudet, started to take soundings to find out how deep the water was. Every 2 hours, he dropped a weight over the side of the boat until it touched bottom, and each time he did, he found it a little shallower until it eventually read just 30 meters or 98 feet. As an experienced seaman, Maudet knew that if the sea was that shallow, there was a chance they might be close to the reefs. He ran to the captain to warn him, and Hugues ordered the ship to turn as quickly as possible, but in the panic, they found themselves heading straight for the coast. Then, all of a sudden, the hull slammed into something, reared up at a steep angle, and then stopped moving. The boat then slid back into the water and was forced back up again. After a third time doing this, the Medusa was stopped and wouldn't budge. The lieutenant then dropped another sound and realized that the seafloor was now only 5 meters below them. They had run aground. Incredibly, the passenger that the captain had asked to navigate hadn't seen Cape Blanco. Instead, what he was looking at was a cloud and had mistaken it for the African coastline. In fact, some of the crew even knew he'd made this mistake, but they had been ordered to take his direction, and disobeying a direct order was a hangable offense. So, they'd set sail as ordered by their captain and quietly hoped it wasn't a cloud after all. This mistake had put them 99 miles off course, heading into shallower and shallower water. If someone capable had been navigating, they might have noticed some of the other telltale signs that the water was shallow, like the white breakers in the sea, the mud under the surface, and the seaweed clinging to the ship's hull. The lieutenant had seen all of this, and that's why he began checking the depth. As was feared, they'd run aground on the bank of Arguin. Most of the crew knew what that meant, and they were terrified. The reef was notorious for sinking ships. On top of that, the distance to the coast from where they were was 31 miles and filled with sharks and other dangerous sea creatures. Ironically enough, a moment earlier, 31 miles was too close to the shore, but now stuck on the bank, it became a long way for them to be stranded. After the initial shock wore off, the crew got to work trying to figure out a way to get off the reef. A council was formed to think of ways they could do that, and the first idea was to wait until the tide reflowed the ship. If they'd gotten stuck at lower tide, they might just be carried back out to sea without issue. But, unluckily enough, they hadn't struck at low tide. They were in the middle of a high spring tide. A spring tide is a phenomenon that happens once a month when the sun, moon, and earth align, increasing gravitational forces and making the high tide higher and the low tide lower. This meant that the water was close to as high as it would get. The next option was to try to lighten the ship, so they went into the stores and threw everything non-essential overboard to lighten the load, but unfortunately it wasn't enough. Next, they thought about getting rid of the ship's cannons. Because it hadn't been a military expedition, Medusa had been stripped of all but 14 of its cannons. But either way, these were heavy, so throwing them overboard would be significant. But incredibly, the captain refused to do that. He refused to let Medusa become defenseless, no matter what peace treaties they'd signed. So, with 14 heavy metal cannons still on board, the ship slowly sunk into the reef, becoming even more lodged in place. When they realized that refloating wasn't an option, they started to think of a way to get to the coast. There were only 6 lifeboats, 2 of which were larger launch barges, and the rest were smaller longboats. This wasn't nearly enough for everybody all at once, but if they made several trips, it just might work. Another idea the council put forward was to accept that the Medusa was a wreck and use parts of it to build a raft that could take supplies and the excess passengers over to the coast. Ultimately, they decided to try building this raft because it meant they'd only need to make one trip. The crew then got to work removing and stripping the topmast, the yardarms, booms, and any other wood they could spare. Then they took these and lashed them together with the rope. The large masts were put on either side, while the shorter masts were fastened horizontally to tie the raft together. 2 more were then placed around the center to make it stable, and a mast and a sail was set in the middle so that it had at least some way of moving on its own. The final platform they constructed measured 66 feet by 23 feet, or 20 meters by 7 meters, and was given the nickname La Machine by the crew. Today, it's known as the Raft of Medusa. The plan was to get enough food for everyone, including those in the boats on the raft and all the people who couldn't fit into the boats. The raft would then be towed behind the rest of the boats, giving everyone the best chance of survival. Unfortunately, on the 3rd night after the wreck, a storm rolled in from the Atlantic and Medusa began to creak and groan in the strong winds, and loud cracks could be heard. Everyone on the ship began to panic and worried that Medusa was about to break up under their feet. The crew quickly put the finishing touches on the raft and started throwing supplies overboard to retrieve and add to the raft afterward. But unfortunately, not everything floated, so much of what was supposed to be used to keep them alive immediately sank without a trace. As all this was going on, the infantry who were on board, who weren't fans of the Navy in the first place, watched in frustration as the situation became more chaotic. In their eyes, not only had the incompetent Navy run aground, but now all of their supplies and their life rafts were in jeopardy as well. Eventually, as the frustration boiled over, they started grabbing weapons and insisting on getting on the raft before anyone else. It was a tense moment, but was thankfully diffused when the rope tying the raft to Medusa snapped. It would have floated away entirely if the crewmen hadn't jumped into one of the boats and headed out to drag it back. This brief panic seemed to ease tensions, at least for the moment. The following day, the officers decided it was time to head for the coast. Any slight hope that the ship might float again had been destroyed by the strong winds the previous night. The crew then prepared some food and bottles of wine to put on the boats, and then at 7 a.m. they were officially given the signal to abandon ship. The captain and the governor and all the important dignitaries and high-ranking officers got on the first barge. Everyone else then boarded the second barge and then the longboats. When the boats were full, there were a total of 120 soldiers, 29 sailors, and about a dozen passengers, including one 12-year-old child and a woman and her husband who weren't related to him. These were all the people who were left on Medusa that would now need to board the raft. And horrifyingly, after only the first 50 people, most of the makeshift raft disappeared underwater. This left people standing on the wooden platform with water up to their ankles. Thankfully, it remained stable enough to float even when full, but it would have been unnerving at the very least. Weirdly as well, not everyone even left the Medusa. 17 men were either abandoned or decided not to go to give up their spots for others. Finally, once everyone was loaded up, the barges began to pull away from the ship with the raft in tow. At first, the men on those boats rowed as hard as they could, but they soon realized that between their own overloaded boats and the raft essentially dragging through the water, getting to the shore might be impossible. Not all of the boats had the same amount of people either, so some were more overloaded than others. As the scene became more and more chaotic, people started jumping and climbing from boat to boat, and bear in mind that between all of the boats in the raft, there were over 300 people to manage. Officers started having to wrestle people off the barges, and soon they essentially stopped moving entirely. It's not clear why the rope was cut. It might be because the boats didn't have enough strength to pull the raft, or it could have been an accident, or as the governor later claimed, it could have simply snapped under the tension. Whatever happened, after less than 2 miles of being dragged towards safety, the raft was left to drift in the ocean, 30 miles from rescue. Initially, the people on the raft assumed that the barges had seen some other vessel and were racing toward it so everyone could be rescued. The only reason the ropes had been cut, they thought, was so that they could sail toward these ships as quickly as possible. But one by one, the boats disappeared from view and there was no sign of another ship coming to their aid. Their next thought was that maybe the boats would return to get them, they just had to wait a little longer. Unfortunately, as they'd soon realized, the crew had no intentions of coming back for them. Soon, they knew they'd been left there to die. Even worse, even though they tried to make a simple mast and sail, they knew there was no chance it could go anywhere. And even if it did move, there was no way they could maneuver it. As the hopelessness of the situation set in, they did a stock take and found that somehow they had only a few barrels of wine and some biscuits recovered from the sea. So not only could they not move, but they had basically no food for over 100 people. As each of these revelations was made, some of the soldiers began to cry out in desperation. Thankfully, an officer took charge and laid out a plan to keep them alive for as long as possible. He suggested that they take the wine and biscuits and turn it into a paste which they could eat as a ration 3 times a day. He reasoned that they were in a busy shipping lane, so somebody would spot them sooner or later. They just had to keep calm and focused and not do anything stupid or panic. Unfortunately, this plan would be short-lived, and by the end of day 1, all the biscuits were gone. On this first day, it was relatively quiet, and everyone sat and discussed how they might save themselves, coming up with plans to attract attention or maybe getting the raft to move in their desired direction. When they were no longer thinking of ways to save themselves, they spent most of that first evening praying for wind to fill their little sail and wondering what happened to the rest of the crew. Unfortunately, when night came, they got more wind than they'd hoped for. A storm whipped up the sea, and with every wave, the people on board fell on top of each other. They eventually tied down a rope to hang on to keep from falling overboard, but this didn't prevent almost everyone from getting injured as they banged into each other in the raft floor. And the storm only got worse, throwing everybody around in the pitch darkness. The soldiers, who weren't used to the sea, started to vomit as they were thrown around and into each other. By the time the storm had calmed down the next morning, around 20 people were already dead. Some had been swept out to sea, and others had been choked in the ropes that held the raft together. The next day was uneventful once again, but then, horrifyingly, the same thing happened the next night. By then, the only portion of the raft above sea level or stable was the center. By then as well, the Navy officers had claimed this spot as their own, claiming their experience meant they should be stationed there to control the sail and watch for rescue. And over the course of the day, the situation just kept deteriorating. Even by day 3, the infantrymen had basically given up all hope and started to drink as much wine as they could. Tensions had already been high and only escalated between these now drunk soldiers and the Navy officers. This then turned into an open plot against the officers, and some of the infantry decided that the best way to kill them was to destroy the raft entirely, even if it meant that they also went down with the raft. Finally, the situation erupted when one of the soldiers ran to the edge of the raft with a small axe and tried to cut one of the ropes that held everything together. When an officer tried to stop him, everything descended into a mass brawl. The two groups attacked one another with axes and swords, and a huge soldier started grabbing a hold of officers and throwing them off the raft into the ocean. While all of this was happening, the regular passengers just watched in horror. All they could do was spectate and hope that neither group turned their attention to them. Finally, at some point, when one of the infantrymen attacked another non-hostile officer, he was swarmed by a group of passengers. This seemed to stop the soldiers in their tracks. Even though they had greater numbers, the mutiny seemed less likely with the passengers against them too. so the fighting stopped for the time being and the infantry moved to the back of the raft. Basically from then on, the raft was in a state of complete civil war. If the Navy shouted to raise the sail, the infantry would cut the rope so that it couldn't be hoisted and then throw the man trying to do it into the ocean. If anyone tried to do anything that could help get the raft ashore, they'd be threatened by one of the soldiers. At one point, the infantry even laid one man over a barrel and threatened to blind him. He only kept his sight because the officers and passengers rushed them and pushed the barrel over to free the man. This went on for essentially all of day 3 as the soldiers did everything in their power to destroy the raft and take the officers with them. And this pseudo-civil war only finally started to calm down as the wine was finished and everyone became weaker without food and water. Unfortunately, this also meant that the next problem they faced was deliriousness. On the 3rd night without water, many of the survivors reported hallucinating and having terrible nightmares, and supposedly as many as 65 people threw themselves into the sea, confused about where they were. On the morning of the 4th day, everyone woke up to find that 12 more people had died overnight. And on that 4th day, without food and especially without water, some of the survivors turned to anything they could. They ate sword belts, leather pouches, bits of leather torn from hats, and even pieces of linen. But it didn't take long for them to realize that that wouldn't work. And then, aside from the last barrel of wine, there was only one food source left. In desperation, some of the survivors began eating the remains of those among them who hadn't been so lucky. By the following morning, now on the 5th day, the youngest person on the raft, 12-year-old Leon, passed away. This meant that only 27 people were left alive of the original close to 200. 15 of these survivors were hanging on, but the rest were either mentally unstable or on the verge of death due to starvation from the wounds they got during the fighting, or both. To the remaining strong, these individuals started to pose a problem. After a heated debate, the stronger survivors decided that if they let the weak die, they'd have enough wine to last another week. If they didn't, they might starve to death within a couple of days. They also thought about putting them on half rations instead, but decided that this slow starvation was cooler than the alternative. So, one by one, they took each of these people and pushed them into the water. The survivors drifted on for another few days with only small sips of wine to sustain them. By day 17 after the wreck, they'd turned the raft's sail into a small tent to fight the sun. It wasn't really propelling them anyway, and they were drifting south, where the stronger sun was peeling their skin and causing even greater exhaustion. So without any other way to save themselves, they just sort of waited in the tent for what was to come. That morning, though, one of the sailors crawled out of their tents to see if they were closer to the shore. Moments later, he ran back in crying with joy and excitement. There was a ship on the horizon, and it was sailing directly toward them. Everyone climbed out of the tent and did their best to attract his attention, and as they waited, they jumped up and down in excitement and hugged each other. It didn't matter if they were Navy or infantry or that they were trying to kill each other just days before. They were being saved, and that's all that mattered. They didn't even care who it was sailing towards them. Being taken as a British prisoner was better than the horror they'd endured in the last 2.5 weeks. As the ship got closer, they noticed it had distinct square sails. This was a ship that they knew, and it was one of theirs. It was the Argus, which was one of the ships that was originally part of their convoy. Finally, it pulled up beside them and lowered its ladders. The ship then took the survivors to St. Louis, but unfortunately, not all of them made it there either. 5 of the 15 were too malnourished or their wounds were too infected, and they tragically passed away. Captain Hugh would go on to return to the Méduse 54 days later to try to recover the gold on board. Incredibly, 3 of the 17 men who were stranded there were still alive, and the Méduse was mostly intact. This also makes you wonder why he wouldn't try to return to the wreck sooner to try to save more of the individuals that were left stranded. In any case, sometime later, one of the survivors published an account in the newspaper that became a scandal in Paris, and Captain Hugh was brought up on several charges. He was eventually found guilty of 2 of them, which were incompetent and complacent navigation and abandoning Méduse before all of its passengers had been taken off. He was then sentenced to 3 years in jail and only narrowly escaped the death penalty because of his noble status. Following this whole ordeal, in 1818, a law was passed that French military promotions could only be based on merit, in hopes of preventing another situation like the Méduse. Theodore Géricault's masterpiece almost captures the horror of what those men went through. The sensibilities of his age made him shy away from cannibalism, and his respect for France's armed forces also made him skip any depiction of the civil war that broke out. But either way, it's still a vivid depiction of one of the most horrible events to ever happen in the French Navy. Hello everyone, and welcome to Scary Interesting. Just a reminder that we now have a Scary Interesting podcast with new episodes released every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern. It features brand new Scary Interesting content, similar to what you see here on YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts. And once again, a huge shout out to Factor for sponsoring this video, and remember to check out the links in the description for 50% off your first Factor box.
It's a calm afternoon in the Indian Ocean, far off the coast of West Australia.
This is a painting by Theodore Jericho known as The Raft. This is Tromelin Island. It is exactly as barren as it looks. So much so that it used to be known simply as the Isle of Sand. In 1761, almost 100 people captured from their homeland were abandoned here, and most of them were never seen or heard from again. This is their horrifying story. Sometime after nightfall on July 31st, 1761, Jean de la Fare looked back and forth between two different maps. He was the captain of a French ship known as L'Utile, and he was in a hurry, but having two maps of the exact same area of the Indian Ocean that contradicted one another wasn't helping. After leaving from the east coast of Madagascar, Captain Jean was guiding his ship in complete darkness while up against winds of up to 20 knots. And unfortunately, he didn't need a map or the ability to see more than a few feet in front of him to know that his ship was off course. Without an accurate and reliable map on the ship, though, he was left to figure it out using bad information. Considering this, the smart move would have been to slow down and wait until the sun came up so he could get his bearings, but time was a luxury Captain Jean could not afford. Along with a crew of more than 140 men, Captain Jean was charged with sailing west from the Isle of France, which is now known as Mauritius, to Madagascar to transport a load of beef and rice. The ship was expected back in the Isle of France in a few days, but Captain Jean had another stop to make first that only he and his crew knew about. Payment for the beef and rice would be a nice sum of money, but Captain Jean couldn't pass up the opportunity to make a lot more. His plan was for the ship to sail past the Isle of France to Rodriguez Island. There, he'd drop off a load of unplanned cargo before returning to the Isle of France with the supplies he was sent to bring back. Below deck, 160 men, women, and children of Malagasy descent, or natives of Madagascar, were locked in the cargo hold to be sold when Captain Jean landed on Rodriguez Island. And the payday he was supposed to get for them went far beyond the worth of beef and rice, so he was anxious to make it to the island from the moment the Malagasy were forced on board. By 1761, they fetched a premium since the governor of the Isle of France ordered a ban on that type of activity. So along with this being a lucrative trip, it was also a highly illegal one. And all these factors weighed heavily on Captain Jean's decision-making. While he tried to figure out where the ship was, the crew were busy executing his orders to keep the ship moving as planned, because in his mind, waiting for daylight wasn't an option. However, had he been just a little bit more patient and at least waited until first light, he would have noticed the tiny island directly in the ship's path. In fact, it wasn't so much the island that would have caused alarm, it was the reef that surrounded it just below the surface. And Captain Jean found out just how protective of the island it was when the choppy waters of the Indian Ocean caused the ship to collide with the reef. Right away, this was a fatal blow to the ship. The hull was smashed open and water overtook it within minutes. Captain Jean and most of his crew abandoned ship and swam to the safety of the island, but even still, 18 of the men were swept out to the sea in the storm and drowned. Horrifyingly, many of the Malagasy in the cargo had no escape from the rushing water, and those who could get out did so through the hole the reef had created. When the ship sank moments after the damage was done, it did so with almost half of the Malagasy still trapped in the cargo hold. As the sun rose and in the wake of losing their ship, the magnitude of their predicament could finally be seen. More than 120 crewmen and between 60 and 80 Malagasy made it safely onto land after the wreck. Unfortunately, they were stranded on an island that at the time was known as the Isle of Sand. And when the survivors could finally see where they were as morning set in, they all must have felt an immediate sense of dread. The Isle of Sand is about the worst place in the world to be stuck. First discovered by France in the 1720s, it's about 300 miles northwest of Reunion Island and 280 miles east of Madagascar, so it's essentially in the middle of nowhere in the Indian Ocean. The island was once a volcano that eroded over millions of years, maybe even longer, and sea levels didn't leave much of it remaining above the water. On top of that, the island has a land area of about a single square kilometer. Imagine an island the size of an average city block. But that's not all. Its highest point is just 23 feet above sea level, so spotting any ships in the distance was out of the question. That's no problem on an island with trees, but the Isle of Sand was literal in name. In fact, outside of a few blades of grass and a couple of shrubs that weren't even knee-high, the island was completely devoid of vegetation. And because there are so few plants, animals aren't exactly plentiful either. There were fish in the water and the nearby reefs, but those same reefs would make fishing difficult. Just about the only easily accessible food are the seabirds that land on the island and the turtles that come up to shore, which is obviously barren by any standards. The island is also just south of the equator and is classified as having a mild tropical climate, but with no trees or shade, temperatures on the island are anything but mild during most of the year. In fact, July and August are the only months when the average temperatures just barely dip below 80 Fahrenheit or 27 Celsius. For the rest of the year, the sun beats down and it's sweltering. Its size and lack of protection from the elements also means that even the most comfortable days are windswept. Violent cyclones and tropical storms also pop up relentlessly during the summer months, which at the very least brings lots of rain. This, as you might imagine, is particularly important for anyone planning on spending any time on the island, since it has no source of fresh water. From the moment Captain Jean washed up on the island with the rest of the survivors, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. The stress and pressure of smuggling the Malagasy illegally and being lost in the Indian Ocean had already been more than enough to deal with. But now, not only would he not be getting that big payday he was looking forward to, but he also wouldn't be able to conceal the highly illegal activity he was up to. If, or when he was rescued from the island, and that was a big if, Captain Jean would have to face the Isle of France governor. This stress eventually became too much for him, and he seemed to have a break from reality. Something in him just snapped, and from then on, he was never the same. With this break, his crew had no other choice but to relieve him of his command. Afterward, First Lieutenant Barthélemy Castellan du Vernet took over and began organizing survival efforts. In the first little while after the stranding, the crew gathered up anything from the ship that washed up on the island, while others swam out to the wreck and retrieved supplies still inside. Because of this, they managed to stockpile a considerable amount of wood, food, and various items that could come in handy. However, something that should have been the top priority, which was sourcing drinkable freshwater, was completely overlooked. Since the crew had control of all the food and water and the Malagasy were not seen as equals, there was little reason for them to address it at the start of their ordeal. This would result in 8 Malagasy dying from dehydration in the first few days. It was only after their deaths that the new captain ordered a well to be dug to find water. And despite their shared circumstances, the social divide between the two groups remained in place. They shared the work side by side, necessary survival tasks like the construction of an oven for cooking and a forge for melting metal, but very little of the food and water stores were shared with the Malagasy. The crew even placed a literal divide between them and the Malagasy by setting up a camp on the opposite end of the island. But the differences between them were no more evident than when Barthélemy ordered that a ship be built with the wreckage of L'Utile. Incredibly, the order wasn't just to build a raft with the scrap wood, it was to build a literal ship from scratch. When it was done, they even gave the new ship a name, dubbing it the Providence. Then, on September 27th, almost 2 months after their stranding, the Providence was loaded up and departed the Isle of Sand. When it did, it left all of the surviving Malagasy behind, with only a promise to send a ship back to rescue them. After 4 days at sea, the Providence arrived back in Madagascar. During the journey, though, an illness spread throughout the ship and killed some of the crewmen, including Captain Jean. So with the commander responsible for everything now dead, Barthélemy was summoned to answer to the Isle of France governor when the crew returned home. And the governor was furious and Barthélemy was lambasted, but despite this, he still tried to convince the governor to send a ship back to the Isle of Sand. Unfortunately, the governor denied Barthélemy each time he asked. At the time, France was in the 7 Years' War with Britain for global dominance, and not a single ship could be spared. This meant that no help was coming from the Malagasy. In the first few months after the Providence left the island, the 60 or so Malagasy waited eagerly for a rescue ship that unfortunately, unbeknownst to them, would never come. Eventually, everyone left behind had little choice but to make the inhospitable island home. Without many natural resources to work with, the Malagasy dug pits in the sand they would fortify with coral rocks to serve as shelters. Morbidly, it was common for the Malagasy at the time to bury their dead in buildings similar to mausoleums we see in cemeteries today. They'd dig large holes and build walls from the bottom of the pits to a few feet above ground. The structure was then covered by a stone roof to complete a small, self-contained underground building intended to house the dead for eternity. This meant that the Malagasy castaways essentially lived inside what they considered to be graves. Even worse, the stranded survivors were all from the central highlands of Madagascar, far from the coastline that surrounds the country. Growing up and capturing food near the ocean was different than what they were used to further inland, which was made all the more difficult by the dramatically few resources available to them. On top of that, one of the few sources of food that was available to them, which were the turtles, were considered taboo to eat in Madagascar. But despite this, any reservations about eating them didn't last long as hunger crept in and they began to starve. The good news, if there was any in their situation, is that turtles didn't have to make up the bulk of their diet, and neither did fish. Although evidence suggests that the Malagasy became skilled fishermen while on the island, they mostly lived on the seabirds since they were the most plentiful food source available. Unfortunately, even though food, water, and shelter were addressed early on, and the Malagasy adapted where they needed to, their population was dwindling. It's not clear whether this was sickness or malnutrition, but either way, people began to pass away. Not long after the crew left the island as well, the Malagasy created a large raft with what was left of the wood. When it was complete, 18 of them climbed aboard and paddled away from the island, hoping to reach anywhere else to bring back help to save the rest of them. Tragically, these 18 were never seen again. As time passed, the original months they were stranded slowly turned to years on the little barren island, and hope began to fade. After 3 years, most of the Malagasy had died, leaving just 15 of the original 60 alive. A year after the Providence landed in Madagascar, Barthélemy left to return to France, but admirably, he continued to ask officials to send a rescue to the Malagasy. The governor held firm every time a letter from Barthélemy arrived, but Barthélemy didn't limit himself to just the governor. He targeted anyone with any kind of political sway who could authorize a rescue effort for them, and his nagging eventually grew too much for the Isle of France Minister of Marine Affairs. In 1772, 11 years after L'Utile sank and with the war over, Barthélemy was finally successful. The Minister of Marine Affairs agreed to send a ship to rescue the Malagasy. This was unfortunately slow moving as well, so another 3 years would pass before any ship even left the port for the Isle of Sand. Not even a reported sighting of the Malagasy by a passing ship in 1773, or Barthélemy getting the French media involved, was enough to speed up the rescue. Then, finally and frustratingly, when the first ship was sent to the Isle of Sand in 1775, it made it to the outer edge of the protective reef before turning back. Then after that, it would be another year before a second attempt was made. That ship took a different route and got as close to the island as the reef would allow, and then anchored in place. The crew dropped a rowboat into the water, and 2 of them hopped in and began rowing toward the island. A storm had begun to blow in shortly before the rowboat departed from the ship, and as if anyone needed any more proof how dangerous the reef was, the rowboat was tossed into the reef by the whitecaps and shattered into pieces, tossing the 2 sailors into the ocean. One of the men swam back to the ship and the other swam to shore, and then watched his ship pull up its anchor and abandon him there. Afterward, the stranded crewmen became part of the small community of Malagasy and eventually led another project to build a raft. The only difference between this raft and the one made more than a decade earlier was its feather sail made from the seabirds who inhabited the island. When the craft was done, the sailor was joined by 6 Malagasy and the raft floated into the Indian Ocean. But again, the raft and everyone else on board were never heard from again. The remaining Malagasy returned to their solitude when the raft left, hopeful that it would reach land and they'd soon be saved. But as months went by, it became clear that no one was coming to save them. You have to imagine that each of these attempts at rescue would only be more devastating when all of their new hope was crushed as time went on. And eventually, they must have even grown accustomed to rescue attempts of every kind failing. They must have finally accepted that they would never leave the Isle of Sand and continued on with any semblance of normal life they established after being left behind by the French crew. But everything changed for them on November 29, 1776. That was the day when a small French warship named the Dauphine pulled into the island under the command of Captain Jacques-Marie Boudin de Tremblay. And what he and his crew found was shocking. Of the 60 to 80 Malagasy who survived the shipwreck, only 7 women remained. One of them was holding an 8-month-old baby that had been born on the island, and all of the rest of them were wearing clothes made from seabird feathers they braided together. Captain Jacques would survey the conditions the Malagasy had been living in and could hardly believe his eyes. There were small buildings clustered together, and a shed had been built from coral stones to store food. The Malagasy even managed to construct a small lookout tower to watch ships. But thankfully, despite all of these amenities they had created, finally their ordeal had come to an end. When Captain Jack brought the women and 1 infant on board and the Dauphine pulled away from the island, it was the first time the Malagasy had been anywhere but the Isle of Sand in 15 years. The women were then brought to the Isle of France and welcomed by its new, empathetic governor. He immediately declared them free and arranged to have them taken back to Madagascar, but the women actually refused to go. It's unclear whether the refusal had to do with the potential of being part of another shipwreck or something else, but the governor accepted their decision and instead gave them citizenship on the Isle of France. The infant and his mother and grandmother were eventually taken in by the governor and went on to live with him on his estate. He also renamed and baptized each of them, making them a part of his family. Then, after the others settled on the Isle of France, history lost track of them, and that was sort of the end of their story. For his successful rescue of the Malagasy, the Isle of Sand was renamed in honor of Captain Jack to Tromelin Island, which is what it is still named today. And the little sandy island is still sitting in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And because of its unlucky inhabitants 300 years ago, it's become an important archaeological site. Since 2006, 4 archaeological expeditions have taken place to uncover how the Malagasy managed to survive for 15 years in a place that's almost completely uninhabitable. The first expedition documented and examined the remains of the shipwreck, and by then the only signs of it were the items that couldn't be lifted to the surface, like anchors, cannons, ammunition, and rigging. Otherwise, the Malagasy had managed to use everything else they had at their disposal. The next expedition focused on locating artifacts and the remains of those who died while stranded. Archaeologists would go on to discover 3 of their buildings, including one that almost certainly was used as a kitchen. It contained the oven that was built when they were first stranded and a stack of copper bowls the Malagasy got from the ship. The bowls showed obvious signs of both wear and repair, which was a significant accomplishment considering what they had available to them. Fixing the copper bowls required bolting a patch of copper over a hole, but the Malagasy had no loose copper, bolts, or many tools. But despite this, they managed to source copper from the shipwreck and then melt it and mold it to create a bowl patch. For rivets, they rolled up thin sheets of copper and drilled holes into the patches by using a combination of bone and other metal tools. Handmade spoons were also found, as was an iron tripod that held cookery over an open fire. There was also a large bowl made of lead found among the kitchen artifacts, leading archaeologists to conclude that the survivors likely dealt with the consequences of lead exposure at some point later in their lives. Then, along with the cooking vessels, the dig uncovered pieces of jewelry made of copper, which included rings, necklaces, and bracelets found in the sand. There was even a comb that had been fashioned from copper to be used to untangle hair. These might seem like inconsequential discoveries, but these were signs that the Malagasy established a small society on the little barren island. And somehow, against all odds, they managed to survive some of the worst conditions imaginable. As far as the other details about the 15 years the Malagasy spent on Tromelin Island, they've been lost to history. A series of interviews was done with each of the survivors, but any record of the details of their first-hand experience has never been located. If you made it this far, thank you. In this video, we're going to look at 3 people who found themselves in horrifying and impossible situations and the lengths they had to go to make it out or not. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In 2022, the Grimes family wanted to do something different for Thanksgiving. Because they were a big family, getting 18 people around a single dinner table wasn't easy. That year, they'd seen a 5-day Thanksgiving cruise across the Gulf of Mexico to Cozumel, which is a small Mexican island, and decided that it looked like a great way to enjoy the holidays. They could all celebrate together, have a good time, and let someone else do the cooking for once. So on the day before Thanksgiving, they boarded a cruise liner, the ship set off, and right away they began to enjoy the shows, music, dancing, and a few drinks. One of the family, James Michael Grimes, found out that an air guitar competition was happening later that evening, and air guitar just happened to be James's party trick. Because the prize was a free drink, there was no way he could let it go to someone else, so when it was his turn, he air soloed his way around the room with enough style and energy to impress the judges. This ended up winning him the free drink, and then afterward, he joined his family and partied some more. At about 11 p.m. that night, he needed to use the bathroom, so he told his sister where he was going and headed for the washroom on the deck just outside. Unfortunately, he never made it to the washroom. Instead, James passed out and fell overboard somewhere between heading out and opening the bathroom door. A little while later, he woke up floating in the ocean with the ship nowhere in sight. Those first moments after waking up had to have been completely terrifying. There was no light or land in any direction, and he also had enough wherewithal to vaguely remember the route of the ship and knew that he was way too far into the Gulf of Mexico to swim to land. This meant that his only hope was to tread water in the darkness and hope that someone noticed he was missing. Incredibly, despite the circumstances, James was determined to survive. The first thing he had to do was just keep swimming. He was more scared of drowning than anything else, so he kept telling himself to keep going, terrified of what would happen if he stopped. Sometimes that was easier than others. One moment he'd be as relaxed as he could, floating on the calm sea, and the next he'd be pulled under the surface by a rip current. Thankfully, James was a construction worker and was used to working long hours of hard physical labor. He might have been dragged under if he hadn't been as fit as he was. He also somehow managed to remain calm because he remembered hearing that panicking was the worst thing you can do if you were trapped at sea, and he managed to keep his cool by taking long, deep breaths whenever he started to feel stressed. Slowly, the minutes turned to hours, and he managed to fill the time by focusing on things that would keep him alive. He made up songs and sang them out loud and thought about his 9-year-old daughter and how badly he wanted to see her again. After a few hours of floating, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his leg. Then another, and then another, and then looking down, he realized he drifted into a bloom of jellyfish, and they were stinging him all over his body. James had to muster up all of his energy to swim through them, with each sting causing him excruciating pain. After a while, he managed to get clear, but it wasn't safe just yet. Then he spotted a fin about 15 feet away, and he knew that the Gulf of Mexico was famous for its shark population. He wasn't immediately sure it was a shark, but then he ducked his head under the water to look, and he could just make out that it was big and it had a long, flat mouth. Then, faster than he thought was possible, the creature was on top of him, bumping into his leg. He immediately kicked as hard as he could and screamed and shouted, hoping to scare it away. And this either worked or wasn't a shark, or it just wasn't interested in him. Either way, he breathed a sigh of relief when it turned and swam off. As the sun began rising on Thanksgiving Day, James realized how hungry and thirsty he was. He started to scan around to see if there was anything to eat or drink, but there was only seawater. Then, just up ahead, he spotted something in the water. He wasn't sure if it was a piece of wood or bamboo, but he reached out, took it, and chewed on it anyway. It tasted okay, and even though it probably had no nutritional value, it at least made him feel like he was eating something. Afterward, he kept on floating, wondering when rescue might come. The night before, pretty quickly, his sister had started to get worried. When he didn't come back from the bathroom, she thought he might have gotten caught up in one of the other parties on the cruise, but she was also sharing a cabin with him, and when he didn't return that night, she decided to tell cruise ship workers. The cruise liner immediately began a search and rescue operation, retracing its steps from the night before. They also contacted rescue services, who let other vessels in the area know that somebody was overboard and to help look for them. And it would take until the following evening for them to find him. At 8:25 on Thanksgiving night, James spotted a tanker in the distance. By then, he was sunburnt from the hot sun and shivering in the cold water. He was also so weak and in so much pain from the sunburns, but he knew he had to keep swimming. Finally, when he got close to one of the ships, someone spotted him. They shouted out to their crewmates for help, and then they strapped a flashlight to a life preserver and threw it as close to them as they could. But unfortunately, the waves kept pushing it back every time James tried to reach it, and he was clearly losing strength. After a few attempts, one of the guys in the boat yelled to him that the Coast Guard was on its way and to keep treading water. It would only take another 15 minutes for a helicopter to appear. It shone its spotlight in the water, but kept missing James, so he pulled off his socks, pants, and boxers and then waved them above his head. When the spotlight finally caught sight of him, he thought he could even hear one of the Coast Guard shout "Gotcha" before they winched themselves down into the ocean beside him. The Coast Guard then threw a rescue sling around James, who just collapsed into it with every bit of his strength gone. He might have only been seconds away from drowning. He was then airlifted to the hospital and treated for hypothermia, and to this day, James swears that he wasn't drunk and has no idea why he passed out or how he ended up in the ocean. Apparently, despite the ordeal, he's keen to go on another cruise, but has promised to stay at least 10 feet from the guardrails. If you've ever wondered what it's like at the South Pole, there is actually a way you can visit. The Adamson Scott South Pole Station has between 50 and 200 people living there at any time, ranging from scientists doing research to engineers, operations, and support staff who keep the center running. A few tourists also fly in during the summer to experience the raw beauty of what is possibly the most remote place on Earth. The best way to get to and from the site is by booking a seat on a specially designed aircraft from New Zealand or Chile. These flights only run in the summer between November and February, and only when the weather allows it. And if you do manage to get there, generally visitors can only stay for a few hours on clear days before flying back while the weather permits. The staff that man the station spend the whole year on site, usually on a one-year contract, and brave the worst of the summer and winter months. In addition to the extreme cold, the Antarctic winter is one long night, or 6 months of near total darkness. The lack of light and the extreme cold also make it too dangerous to fly there in winter, so if there's a problem, it's up to the overwinter staff to fix it. As you might imagine, when living somewhere so remote and challenging, there's no shortage of injuries. But because the population is so low and the people working there are trained to be as careful as possible, they rarely need more than one medic on standby in case something happens. The station's medical officer is usually a tough and experienced physician, and in the 1998-1999 season, that post was filled by Dr. Jerry Nielsen. Jerry, like other doctors at the station before her, had extensive experience. After graduating from the Medical College of Ohio, she worked in several hospitals, building a reputation as an excellent emergency room doctor. Then, after a painful divorce, she needed a change of scenery and somewhere she could escape from it all and get past the heartbreak. When she saw a wanted ad for a new medical officer at the South Pole Research Station, she couldn't imagine a more exciting place for her to begin. She would even call Antarctica a blank slate in which you could write your soul. After arriving, summer on the ice came and went, and it was pretty uneventful. An injury here, a little sickness there, and then in February 1999, she watched the last plane until November take off and prepared for the long winter months ahead. As part of this preparation, Jerry thought it was vital to ensure that she was healthy before checking anyone else. There were people on the base that knew how to give first aid, but she knew that if she was ever too sick to do her job, there was a serious problem, especially in winter. About a month after the last plane took to the air, Jerry was performing a routine self-examination when she found a small lump in her breast. She wasn't exactly sure what it was, but she knew it wasn't there the last time she checked. Obviously, she had to find out what it was, but unfortunately, although the station's medical center is well equipped, anything non-invasive like a mammogram wasn't an option. There were scientists at the station who might be able to check what the lump was if she could get to it, but there wasn't anyone with any training in doing that sort of procedure. Even Jerry wasn't all that experienced in that specific procedure. Her specialty was emergency services, a role which was perfect for the Antarctic station most of the time, but not something like this. She decided to ask for advice from colleagues in the US via emails and teleconferences, and after lengthy discussions, they could only come up with one solution. Experienced or not, the only person there with the skill to do that sort of surgery was Jerry. She would have to perform a biopsy on herself. So she assembled a small team from other medically trained personnel and began practicing by extracting cells from inside raw chicken using a hypodermic syringe. When she felt confident enough, Jerry got her medical crew together and broke out the biopsy kit she brought with her. Inside were 2 needles and 2 syringes. One was a 25 gauge, which was a small and thin needle she'd need later in the procedure. The other was a bigger 22 gauge needle, half a millimeter across. She attached it to one of the syringes and then filled it with the sedative lidocaine. While the team checked her vitals, she jabbed the needle into her right breast a few times, pumping a little of the anesthetic to deaden the region around the lump as best she could. Then she took the other needle and syringe and plunged it in, piercing skin and connective tissue until she could feel
I love
resistance
Mugen,
from
I
the
have
small
a
tumor.
roster, I'm
She then
adding
jabbed the lump and
characters
pulled
to
back on the
it
plunger to
when
extract
I'm
as much
using
material
the
as possible, which was then sent
HDMI
off
for
to be
it
analyzed.
because my screen
Unfortunately,
is
when the sample
cracked.
returned from the lab, it was the worst news she could have possibly gotten, which was that it was inconclusive. Their equipment was too old to say whether she had cancer or not, so she contacted the US again for more help and a new plan. It didn't take long to come up with one, but they knew that landing a plane at that time of year was too dangerous. However, they had done emergency drops in the
Office
past.
pyon.
Although it was too dark and too cold to land, a pilot could still fly to the South Pole and follow the ring of fires that staff had lit outside the station. Once spotted, they dropped the supplies down in parachutes. So on July 11th, the US military aircraft flew out of Christchurch, New Zealand, with better testing equipment and medical supplies, including chemotherapy drugs. Once the cargo was recovered, a new test was done, and it turned out that she needed the medication after all. Jerry had an aggressive form of breast cancer, and she still had months to go before she could reach a hospital. The US government immediately started to work out how to get her home early, but the best they could do was the beginning of October. In the meantime, Jerry returned to her small medical team and taught them how to administer chemotherapy so she could begin treatment while waiting to fly out. It was a tough time, but Jerry refused to stop working, patching up hip injuries and prescribing antibiotics until the rescue planes landed. Finally, in October, when the weather improved, Jerry and the scientist with the hip injury were flown out of the station on October 15th. After she returned to the US, she began treatment, including multiple surgeries and a mastectomy. For 10 years, the cancer went into remission, and Jerry spent that time lecturing about her ordeal all over the world, including back at the Antarctic station and in a memoir. Tragically, in 2005, her cancer returned with a vengeance, spreading throughout her body, and sadly, she passed away on June 24th, 2009. Mount Nebo is a small community roughly
イン
11
トライ
miles
ング
west
トゥ
of
ダウンロ
Brisbane,
ード
Australia.
バランス
The
オ
area
ーバ
is
ー
home to just over
1700 is
people,
characters
with such a small
for my
population,
own
these
channels
thin, scattered
tournament
buildings is almost
pretty time
invisible on the map.
consuming to be
The woods
honest.
surrounding it, on the other hand, are over 40 miles long at their longest and 12 miles wide and follow the contours of the D'Aguilar mountain range, which borders farmland and many communities on the northern end of Brisbane. It was in this beautiful green landscape on the 15th of September 2019 that 54-year-old Neil Parker chose to go hiking, as he often did. He was a founding member and experienced guide of the local Bushwalker Club who had covered this route many times before. And not only that, he was a member of the Australian State Emergency Service, which is a group of different support agencies covering everything from fires, floods, earthquakes, motor vehicle accidents, maritime rescue, and helicopter search and rescue, which he had done for years at that point. To describe Neil as prepared would have been an understatement. He would normally have been the one coming to people's rescue, if not for a simple twist of fate. Along Neil's route, about 40 minutes off the last major trail and an hour and 40 into the whole trek, was a small waterfall along Cabbage Street Creek, cascading down a shale cliff. This cliff is shaped like a row of shelves or a ladder, and the shale made for an easy climb, and it was a common part of Neil's route. Approaching it, he tucked his walking poles into his bag and began the ascent once more, looking forward to the beautiful view from the top, when something moved under his hand. The lichen along the rocks had begun to dry out in the Australian spring, and its roots had weakened. Frantically, Neil reached out, trying to grab a hold of another ledge, and briefly managed to do so before his momentum ripped the stone from his hand and he tumbled down from a height of 6 meters or 20 feet. He slammed into another ledge on his left side, flipping end over end before landing in about a meter of water at the bottom of the falls. Thankfully, Mount Nebo isn't especially large and neither are its waterways, so Neil wasn't in great danger of drowning. But as the moment passed and he came to rest on the shore of the creek, he knew he was in a terrible situation. Neil's left leg had broken just above the ankle during the fall and was so badly damaged that the foot was only attached by soft limp tissue. His left arm was also broken above the wrist, leaving a whole side of his body physically useless and preventing him from using a crutch to walk. He knew he needed help badly, but the mountain valley left him with no cell signal to speak of. Worse still, when he tried to put the phone back in his pocket with one hand, it slipped away and was lost in the creek.
You should get Android 21 ドラゴンボール&エナジーブレーンサムキャラクターレコマンデーションズ
No one even knew that he was missing. Maybe a degree of complacency had caught up with him, or maybe he'd simply gone hiking here so often that he didn't want to be a bother telling people over and over again. But either way, no one knew he was there that day. To add insult to injury, the emergency beacon he would have normally had with him, which would have gotten him rescued immediately, had been left at his ex-wife's house during their separation. And while the normal mental image many people have of Australia is of a wide-open savanna, Mount Nebo is anything but. The tree cover is so dense in most places that even where trails and streams are marked, they're often completely invisible beneath the canopy. Having been a part of rescue teams before, he knew how hard it would be for them to see him where he was. So, the one and only way Neil was going to be found was to do it himself. He was going to have to crawl. Knowing this, and knowing there weren't any more chances he could afford to take or resources he could squander, he pulled out his first aid kit and used his walking sticks to make a splint and reset his shattered ankle by hand. Then he tied it in place with bandages and put his left arm in a sling. He could only hope that these shattered bones hadn't caused serious internal bleeding. Even so, the process to do so would have been agonizing under the best circumstances.
Boeing making a full weave roster pyon 3D モデルアーバンド from this roster unless it is somewhat fresh with the characters pyon.
Neil could only hope that someone would be there, but to get there, he would have to undertake the hardest challenge of his entire life. Ingeniously, though, Neil tied his broken leg with a length of bandage to the still working elbow of his broken arm in such a way that he could pull his arm forward and lift his foot off the ground, effectively hog-tying the left side of his body. This saved him from having to drag his broken foot along the ground, which ran the risk of further damage, but also meant he would need to lift the weight of his leg and carry it every time he crawled.
Do you like
For some very
Dragon
rough
Ball
math, let's say
Fighters?
Neil could pull himself between 5 and 10 centimeters, or 2 to 4 inches at a time, with just his right arm and leg, given that the ground is uneven. That averages out to about 40,000 repetitions. Consider still that the general rule for hiking over rough terrain is that every step takes 2 steps, because you have to constantly go around objects, up and down hills, and so forth, and that Neil would have to do all of this in excruciating pain. So in total, that's a minimum of 84,000 repetitions, or far more as he lost strength and made less progress as time went on, all with only the food and water that he had on him for a short 3-hour hike. This ended up being so great an effort that he needed to stop and rest every 1 to 1.5 meters, or every 3.5 feet to catch his breath. Neil made his way inch by inch down the mountainside, following the side of the creek, out of Sunday and then into Monday. That first evening, he saw a rescue helicopter fly overhead and it became clear just how hard a time they would have seeing him where he was. Exhausted, Neil spent the night huddled under an
It's not
emergency thermal blanket he
BT3
brought
but
with him, and
it's a
rationed
face
the little bit of
for
food he
an
had,
all
which was
right
a little more than a
DBZ
handful of
game
nuts,
3.
trail bars, and candy. Finally, on Monday morning, when Neil failed to arrive at work, a series of phone calls began. His employer called Neil's ex-wife, who further called other members of Neil's family, his sisters, friends, and so forth. No one had seen him. But Neil's journey had only just begun. He spent the entirety of Monday continuing to crawl down the mountain. His progress, measuring in hours what he could have previously walked in just a few minutes. As Neil pushed himself, the thought that kept him going was his son. They hadn't spoken in years, and he wasn't ready to leave things off like that. Neil had to make things right, and he wasn't ready to give up and wither away on a mountainside. On Monday afternoon, one of Neil's friends received a concerned phone call, and when asked if he knew where he was, that friend remembered Neil mentioning a hike earlier in the week. Finally, there was some indication of where he was, and Neil's own bushwalker club sprang into action alongside his family. Dozens of people who knew him and had spent years hiking with him set out into the wilderness in search teams, and word passed to those he worked with in the emergency services.
I can't
That
wait
night,
for
Neil found a clearing
Sparkling
farther down the
Zero.
creek and slept out in the open, hoping that someone would see him this time. When he awoke, the pain, hunger, and exhaustion crept up on him from the full 2 days of effort, and he lay there recovering for some time. But then, thankfully,
I'll be adding DBZ キャラクターズエベンチュアリー In on the Toho right now pyon.
Picking up the reflective foil blanket and waving it with his good arm, before finally the helicopter came closer and closer and he saw that it was a Queensland Government Air Rescue helicopter. Moments later, a search and rescue technician rappelled down to see him. They stabilized Neil's injuries as best they could and loaded him into a rescue basket. By the end of the day, he was admitted to a hospital in Brisbane in good spirits and talking to reporters, and reunited with his family and friends. He fully intended to return to hiking, but said he likely won't return to extreme stuff, even if it's in his nature to be adventurous. Hello everyone, my name is Sean and welcome to Scary Interesting. I'm still deciding on whether or not this will be a permanent series, but in the meantime, if you have a story suggestion that you think will fit
Also
this
me
series,
too.
feel free to
Just
send it to the
hoping
email in the
they
description.
done mess it
We
up
also have
my
a Scary Interesting
DLC pyon.
Discord, which I will link in the description. Have you ever had a near-death experience? How did that impact your day-to-day life from then on? Was your
There's a
perspective
Toho
forever
edit
altered, or
called
did life simply go on
Tenko
and you
Tenshi
considered yourself to
edit.
be lucky? Well, the stories in today's video are about some people who escaped death by the absolute thinnest, almost unbelievable margins. And as I'm sure you'll see, it's hard to imagine how their lives could be the same afterwards. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Some people never figure out what they truly want in life and go their entire lives searching for that thing, while others just seem to get lucky and figure it out almost right away. Chris Jones was one of these people. After going out in his uncle's plane as a kid, he just knew that he wanted to be up in the sky in some capacity. Unfortunately, at just 12 years old, he had his first seizure and was diagnosed with epilepsy. This sort of crushed his dreams of becoming a pilot because you can't get a pilot's license if you're at risk of having a seizure.
Everyone
Any risk
gets
of it
one
occurring in the
entry
air is
and
just too
this they
high.
are
So, Chris
considered
went on
a
to pursue different
completely
things and went to
different
university, and then
character
when he was
pyon
at university,
030.
he happened to go skydiving. Instantly, Chris's passion for being in the air was reignited. He decided that if he couldn't fly planes, he would just jump out of them instead. Now, typically, epileptics aren't allowed to go skydiving either, but since Chris had been seizure-free for almost a decade, his doctor agreed that it would be safe for him to go. Almost right away, he signed up for a skydiving academy in Perth, Australia, where he went on to completely crush the classes. He was basically the star of the class, he aced all the tests and procedures, and all of his tandem jumps were perfect. After completing all that stuff, the next phase was to complete his
高鬼
first solo
悪魔を煽
skydive.
り
So
し
far,
ロー
he
リ
was been
ー
strapped to
ロ
the
ー
instructor.
リー
So, as soon as he could, his solo skydive was scheduled and he was back up in a little Cessna airplane packed with other students as it flew over the Australian countryside. This was going to be his 5th jump as a student, but his first ever on his own. As the plane climbed to about 12,000 feet, Chris sat alone on one of the bench seats and anxiously watched a series of lights on the interior wall. Soon enough, the lights flashed green, which was the pilot's signal that they were at altitude and the skydivers were good to begin their jumps. Chris then stood up and made his way to the door where his instructor Sheldon was standing. He gave his instructor an okay, and then Sheldon opened the plane door and the wind rushed in from outside. Instantly, Chris was hit with a wave of adrenaline as he realized that this was really happening. He was really about to jump out of a plane on his own. Chris then got into the ready position at the doorway and grabbed onto the railing on the exterior of the plane. He then gave Sheldon a second okay, and Sheldon gave the signal back. Then he yelled loudly, up, down, hard arch, which is the final ready call, and then he let go of the railing and plummeted away from the aircraft.
さあ
Sheldon followed him out a few seconds later and then caught up to him to visually confirm that everything was okay. As Sheldon made his way over to him, he saw that he was belly down, legs back, basically textbook falling position and the one you typically see skydivers in. From their dropout altitude of 12,000 feet, they would free fall until about 5,000 feet before they opened their parachutes. During the free fall, they'd perform some maneuvers
I
and
think
practice some
my
protocols, and
favorite
the first thing
Dragon
they
Ball
need to do is check their
characters in
altimeters to
Mugen
make sure
are
they were on
Goku,
track.
Blue Vegeta, Blue
Sheldon
Bra
checked his
and
first,
Baby
and then motioned
Vegeta.
to Chris to check his, and they both
So
saw that
many
they were around
Toho
10,000
edits
feet
I
away.
have to be
Then at
careful of
9,000
two
feet, Sheldon
adults
gave Chris
of
the
them
signal
are
for an aerial
super
left-hand
cheap
turn, which is
slash
basically like a barrel
unbalanced.
roll over and then back to normal position again. Chris gave an okay signal and then started to make his turn. About halfway, so now on his back, Chris just stopped and seemed to get stuck. This left him with his back toward the ground and he was no longer looking at Sheldon. Then Sheldon saw his knees start to come up towards his chest and his arms bent and started to flail wildly. Now, Sheldon was highly experienced and had done over 10,000 skydives in his career. And in all those attempts, although it was rare, students occasionally got too overwhelmed on their first solo dive and passed out. That's what Sheldon assumed was happening. Except, Chris was actually having a seizure and had completely blacked out and was now convulsing through the air.
All
Because he had no
Vegeta
control over his legs,
XD.
he was creating much
There is
less
a one
drag
I
on his
mentioned in
Immediately
cheap.
upon beginning to convulse, he dropped away from Sheldon so quickly. Sheldon immediately pointed his head down to go after him, but they were now dropping much faster than they intended. They rocketed past 7,000 feet, then 6,000, then 5,000. At this point, Sheldon's altimeter started beeping to signal him to open his parachute, but Chris was still far below him. Finally, he managed to catch up to him, but he came in too fast and had to break away again. Chris continued tumbling again with Sheldon right behind him, and then Sheldon slammed into him and grabbed a hold of him. With the beeping in his helmet even louder than before, he reached across Chris's body and rolled him over. Then he pulled his ripcord and the parachute exploded from Chris's back. Immediately, Chris was ripped from Sheldon's hold and up into the air as his parachute opened. With that, Sheldon was able to breathe a sigh of relief and then pulled his own ripcord to open his own parachute. At the same time, the person on the ground had been radioing Chris for some time, but obviously Chris was non-responsive. And even though his chute had opened, he was still far off course from where the landing zone was. The person continued to give him instructions
Felicia
in
from
which to
Dark
return, but by that
Stalkers
point,
she's
it figured that Chris
cool.
was likely unconscious or his radio wasn't working. Then, at about 3,000 feet, Chris slowly came to and was shocked to see that he was in the air and his parachute was open. As he lifted his head to look at it, he came to the realization that he'd probably blacked out, but thankfully, his training kicked in and then he went through his checklist. He checked to make sure his chute wasn't tangled and then his altimeter, and for the first time he registered that someone was talking to him over the radio. Over the course of the next few minutes, he followed the instructions of the person on the ground and slowly made his way back on course. He got down to about 300 feet with the radio encouraging him the entire time and then made the perfect landing right on target. At that point, Sheldon was already on the ground and waiting, and Chris ran up to him and hugged him and told him that he had saved his life. Ironically, from that day forward, he hasn't had any more seizures, but unfortunately realized that he just can't risk skydiving either. Believe it or not, this was actually all caught on video. I will link that video in the description if you want to check it out. On the northeast coast of Sweden is the city of Umeå, which is the 13th largest in the country.
Hey, I just
Since the
recently
university was
come
built in the
aware there was
60s,
a community
it's been growing
behind
rapidly
this
ever
game
since and has doubled in
pyon.
population several times. But despite this rapid growth, it has a relatively small population of just 130,000 people. And although the city itself looks like most other developed cities, the area around it is
But
sparsely
my
populated and
favorite
covered in
Dark
dense
Stalker
forests.
is release.
Then, because of how far north it is and how far below freezing temperature it can get, a popular hobby of the people who live there is snowmobiling in these forests in the wintertime. In 2012, at the end of February, a man was on his snowmobile on one of these snowmobile tracks when he noticed a massive pile of snow just a little way off the trail. He had his helmet on and his visor down, so he couldn't quite make out what it was in the distance, so he turned around and went toward this object. As he got closer, he started to realize that it might be a car buried under all of the snow. The snow was basically all the way up to the roof, and then there was another 3-foot pile sitting on the roof on top of that. The windows were also completely iced up, so it had clearly been there for some time. The man thought to himself that this was kind of weird. He must have discovered a wrecked car or something. So he parked his snowmobile right up next to the car and then got off and waded up to the windows in the waist-deep snow. Then he went right up to the window and started scraping some of the ice off. Then, when there was a big enough hole for him to see inside, he cupped his hands against the window and looked inside. All over the interior, he could see ice caked up on the inside of the glass and the dashboard and everything else. There were also food wrappers and garbage all over the floor and seats. Then, all of a sudden, something moved in the back seat. The man was shocked to see someone lying in the back seat in a sleeping bag staring back at him through the icy window. Soon enough, emergency services were on the scene and pulling out an emaciated man who could barely move or speak. As they got him out of the car, he was so weak that
ベルホエンアイスタートザターニー You can use your pion points to buff, nerf, change the version of characters you like pion. Are you watching something in the background?
And for some of that time, the temperatures outside had dropped to negative 22 Fahrenheit or negative 30 Celsius. At first, this seemed completely unbelievable. But then as the man recovered in the hospital and was given fluids and food, he was able to give a full account of what had happened. Apparently, back in December, he had been driving around on the forest trail and accidentally went too far before getting his vehicle stuck in the snow. Rather than try to walk out of the
Yay,
forest to
not
try to contact
trying
someone
to
for help,
tire
he decided to
myself
just
of
stay in
the
his vehicle.
stage music pion.
Initially, he used the car's heaters to keep warm, but eventually he ran out of gasoline. By that point, the car was covered in enough snow that it sort of formed an igloo around the car. He also had warm enough clothing and a sleeping bag that he was able to keep warm enough to survive. Initially as well, he had some snacks that he brought with them, but those quickly ran out, and so he had survived on melted snow for water ever since. By the time he was found by the snowmobiler, he was incredibly malnourished and succumbing to hypothermia. Basically, had he been found any later, he probably wouldn't have made it. Eventually, it was also uncovered that prior to his disappearance, he had recently broken up with his long-term girlfriend, and in addition to that, he'd managed to amass $150,000 in debt over the years. So, one day, he just decided to drive out into the woods and sort of whatever happened, happened. Investigators were also puzzled by the fact that no one had reported him missing, but apparently he'd always been sort of a recluse, so there was no one who even thought to tell anyone. During those 2 months, he'd lost a total of 50 pounds, but would make a full recovery in the hospital. There are also several pictures of the inside and outside of the car that show all the snow covering it and the frost inside of it, but I couldn't get the proper licensing for those pictures, so if you want to take a look at those, you'll find them with a quick Google search.
I have random matches playing to make sure there are no busted characters
By the
while
early
I look
1990s,
for more
Michael Benson
pyon.
had become one of Hollywood's most well-respected, well-known cameramen. He was talented and ambitious and had filmed for blockbuster hits like The Patriot Games, Terminator 2, and oddly enough, a movie called Volcano, where the main characters race against the clock to save LA from a volcano that had been triggered by an earthquake on the San Andreas Fault. But ironically, Michael's most memorable brush with a volcano came in late 1997, while filming an actual volcano for a movie called Sliver starring Sharon Stone and William Baldwin. Even as a kid, Michael Benson knew he wasn't cut out for a regular 9-to-5 job. He was the type of kid always looking for adventure and spent much of his time taking photographs of the world around him, so it was only natural that he decided to pursue a career in photojournalism. After wrapping up his education at NYU's Graduate Film School, Michael landed high-profile jobs at magazines like Rolling Stone and the New York Times before eventually deciding to head out on his own. Michael knew that he'd have more control over his own destiny as a freelance journalist, and with his impressive resume, soon enough, his choice of jobs began rolling in. Then, in mid-1997, a sequence of events that would forever change his life were set in motion when he received an unexpected call from an executive at Paramount Pictures. What Paramount needed for the closing scenes of the movie they were filming was dramatic aerial footage of one of the world's most active and unpredictable volcanoes, known as the Pu'u'o crater, located in the southeast corner of the Big Island of Hawaii. Towering at nearly 3,000 feet above sea level for more than a decade, the crater had racked up a reputation for leveling homes, long stretches of coastal highway, and sending locals fleeing from their homes in the area. Michael knew that shooting from a helicopter for such a dangerous environment was risky, but he'd already done similar work, and that was also sort of part of the fun of the job. Confident he could pull it off, and excited about how it might add to his already impressive resume, Michael immediately reached out to film technician Chris Duddy to see if he was up for the challenge. Chris was also interested, and Paramount thought the potential rewards far outweighed the risks, and with the movie's release date approaching, things began falling into place. Michael and Chris arrived in Hawaii a few days before the scheduled shoot in late November and promptly met with pilot Craig Hosking to come up with a game plan and familiarize themselves with the helicopter from which they'd be working. Then, on November 27th, they made a last-minute stop at a local liquor store to pick up a bottle of gin, and a few hours later, the trio lifted off and headed for the crater. The flight was relatively short and uneventful, and after a quick circle over the target area,
Do you
Craig
have
eased the
a
helicopter
favorite
down into the
genre of
crater
music?
so Chris could uphold a local tradition. At just the right moment, Chris smiled at the other two and then tossed the bottle of gin into the crater as an offering to Madame Pele, the goddess of fire and creation in Hawaiian religion and mythology. But almost like a bad omen for things to come, Chris missed the pool of molten lava and the bottle came to rest by the crater's wall a few feet away. All of a sudden, Craig started to struggle to control the helicopter in unpredictable wind gusts and poor visibility caused by hydrogen and sulfur vapors wafting up from the volcano. Seconds later, Michael and Chris heard Craig yell over the intercom that they had a serious problem. Looking up through the haze, they were shocked that the sheer wall of the crater was directly in front of them, and in an instant, the helicopter was rocked by a violent shudder as the rotor tip slammed into volcanic rock. Now just 20 feet over the crater floor, the helicopter crashed downward and was ripped into 3 pieces, barely missing a pool of lava that would have burned
I
all
love
3 men
any
alive.
music with a first
Incredibly, despite the
abashi,
suddenness
not
and
of
violence of the
Nokia's
accident,
beat.
as they picked themselves up out of the dust cloud, all 3 of the men were surprised to find that they were all alive and sustained only minor injuries. Seconds later, though, they realized that even though the impact hadn't killed them, they were now trapped near the bottom of an active volcano. Surrounded by pools of superheated lava and clouded by noxious vapors, they were about 200 feet from the crater's surface, which were essentially cliffs of rock and sand. Unfortunately, they had no way of knowing if anyone knew the helicopter had even
I
gone
like
down.
rap
And
like
if authorities were
Snoop
aware of
Dogg
the crash,
H
there was no
is
telling how long
really
it
good.
would take to mount a rescue. They couldn't just wait indefinitely in a volcano. Either way, it was clear that they have to take matters into their own hands. Now in the late morning, Chris and Michael spent nearly 2 hours trying to climb their way out, while Craig stayed behind to repair the helicopter's radio to call for help. But despite struggling desperately up the sheer walls, they made barely any progress because with each foot they gained, the loose volcanic rock crumbled under the weight and sent them sliding down to their original starting points. Finally, through sheer determination, the two of them managed to figure out a strategy to make progress without sliding so far back down. Michael eventually made it to a narrow outcropping of rock about 100 feet below the crater's rim, and Chris managed to get even higher before stopping to catch his breath to consider his options. In their efforts to climb out, the two of them had sort of split off in different directions, and although they were just 50 feet from one another, neither of them could see or hear the other through the vapor clouds and the crackling of the volcano. Worse yet, they weren't even sure if the other was still alive. They also ended up kind of trapped in inaccessible positions in a particularly unstable portion of the crater. And although they were so close to the rim, their locations were completely obscured by low-level clouds.
Gay old school is nice though, maybe because in getting older, newer stuff is iffy with me.
Then, while they sat on their little rock ledges, the two of them began to hear the sound of helicopter blades somewhere above the vapor clouds. First, rescuers contemplating using a helicopter to hover over the area and hoist them out, but with strong wind gusts and rain blowing in from the coast, they feared that attempting to save them via helicopter might result in another crash and possibly even fatalities. At the same time, ground-based rescuers were dealing with their own issues. Excessive movement from above could send rocks and cinders down on top of them, and the rescuers weren't even sure where they were. The only thing they had to work off of was a guess based on where the helicopter wreckage was. At the same time as well, Chris and Michael repeatedly yelled down to Craig, but hearing no reply, they feared he might have succumbed to noxious gases or had fallen into one of the lava pits on the crater floor. At the crater rim, even though they couldn't see either of the two men, rescuers blew whistles and yelled down, hoping that if they were nearby, it would be enough to give them hope of being rescued soon. But the hope of a quick rescue waned as the afternoon dragged into the evening, and Michael and Chris prepared themselves for a long, cold, and miserable night. Now, in basically complete dark, other than the dim light given off by the lava, all they heard were the hissing vapors and gusting winds as they sat on their little ledges. It gave their already terrible situation an almost otherworldly feel. Then, adding insult to injury, the temperature dropped and they were intermittently pelted by cold rain. At some point in the night, in a cruel twist of irony, they began to think that they might die of hypothermia inside of an active volcano. Thankfully, both men somehow survived the night, but by sunrise, they were in terrible shape mentally and physically. Although they had heard the helicopter blades the day prior, they still had no clear indication that a rescue was ongoing. That morning, Chris decided to make a last desperate attempt to climb out of the volcano. He said a quick prayer, yelled over to Michael, waited for a reply that never came, and then began climbing as hard as he could toward the edge. Getting a solid foothold and making progress was still difficult, but he figured out that he could prevent himself from backsliding by digging his elbows into the cinders. At one point, as he climbed, he dislodged a large chunk of rock that rocketed down into the crater and just barely missed Michael. At the same time, Michael couldn't see what had caused the rockfall, but assumed that it was Chris falling to his death from somewhere above him. In the end, it took Chris almost 6 hours to cover the last 100 feet, and at approximately 2:30 p.m. on Sunday the 28th, 27 hours after the crash, he heaved himself up and over the rim to the surprise of nearby rescuers. Michael's situation, on the other hand, just continued to get worse. He had lost all hope of being rescued, his anxiety was giving him panic attacks, and he started to have hallucinations. While some of the auditory hallucinations may have been voices of the rescuers above, others seemed to be taunts from the volcano itself. Others were even heartbreaking messages from friends and family pleading with him not to give up. To distract himself, Michael prayed, recited the alphabet backward, and tried to capture the rain in his hands to quench his thirst. At one point, in complete frustration, he stood up and screamed into the volcano that he wouldn't let it take his life, but, like his attempts to communicate with Chris and Craig earlier, he was only met with silence. Then, there was an unexpected break in the weather. All of a sudden, Michael looked up and there was a helicopter flying above him. He stood up and waved his arms wildly as the helicopter seemed to try to get into position. But almost as quickly as the clouds had dissipated, they rolled in once again and completely obscured the view of Michael down the ledge. With his target out of sight, the pilot held the helicopter as steady as he could while the technician lowered the rescue basket down from the haze. After giving Michael what they thought was enough time to crawl in, the basket was slowly winched up from the cloud. Finally, it lifted into view and they were ecstatic to see that it wasn't empty. Michael later described the short trip out of the crater as the ride of his life. During that time, he found out that Chris had managed to climb his way out, and Craig had been rescued as well the day prior when they first heard the helicopter. Upon hearing this, he turned back toward the volcano to let it know that he and his colleagues had won. Michael was later treated for a number of minor injuries, including laryngitis and inflammation of the lungs, and Paramount Pictures later released the movie the following year with a different ending that didn't require aerial footage of the volcano. Although it's not entirely clear why the helicopter crashed in the first place, it's it's likely that the engine stalled after taking in vapors from the crater, or the gas had thinned the air to such an extent the rotors couldn't create enough lift to keep it in the air. According to the local park service, the rescue effort cost nearly $50,000, and it's rumored that Paramount Pictures picked up some or all of the tab. Hello everyone, my name is Sean and welcome to Scary Interesting. Depending on how much all of you enjoyed this video, I'm thinking of turning this into an entire series, because there's on December 7th of the year 2000,
have
a
a VOD
23-year-old
after
assistant
it
basketball
ends.
coach named Andrew Schreiber parked his 1998 Ford Expedition at a convenience store in East Wichita. He walked inside the store, bought something, walked out again, and then hopped back into his SUV. As he was sitting down, he noticed a man out of the corner of his eye quickly walking towards him. By the time he shut the door, the man had closed the distance and Andrew was staring at the barrel of a gun through the glass window. The man then ordered Andrew into the passenger seat and then got into the driver's seat himself. He then put the vehicle in reverse, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove off into the night with Andrew as his hostage. This incident would be the beginning of a series of crimes that are considered some of the most gruesome in the city's history.
ヒットミル、especially during the tournament.
Non-graphic descriptions of the events, your discretion is still strongly advised. Reginald Carr Sr. and Janice Harding had a total of 4 children over the course of their relationship. Janice first got pregnant when the couple were just teenagers, and after finding out she was pregnant, the two of them decided they wanted to get married. Fearing Janice's mother's reaction, though, the couple decided to wait until after Janice turned 18. Once she was 18, she would legally be an adult, so her mother could disapprove but couldn't really do anything about it otherwise. Following their marriage, Janice gave birth to their first child, which was a girl they named Tamika. Then they had a second child that they named Reginald Dexter Carr Jr. He was born in Cleveland, Ohio on November 14, 1977. A little over a year later, the couple had a third child, another girl named Regina. Then, around 2 years after that, their fourth and last child, Jonathan, was born on March 30th, 1980. During their early years, Janice was a stay-at-home mom and dedicated most of her time to her children. They all lived in a safe, middle-class neighborhood, and for the time being, everything was pretty normal. Unfortunately, at just 2 years old, Regina became incredibly ill for some unknown reason. After doctors ran some tests, she was tragically diagnosed with leukemia. Both parents worked together to bring her to appointments and get her treatment, but this only bought her another year before she passed away at just the age of 3 years old. Despite the tragedy, the young parents did their best to provide their other 3 children with a decent life and a loving home. In the beginning, religion and going to church on Sunday were a big part of raising their family, and Reginald Sr. worked at a factory in Cleveland as a chemist, which was a great job to have at his age. However, the loss of Regina started to take a toll on the couple's marriage. For unknown reasons, Janice began blaming Reginald Sr. for Regina's death, and eventually, their relationship fell apart completely and ended in them getting a divorce. Janice eventually moved to Dodge City, Kansas, hoping to start fresh with her and her 3 kids, and soon enough, she had remarried. This should have been a positive thing, but it wouldn't take long for things to take a drastic turn for the worse. The 2 brothers, along with their older sister, began being subjected to things that no child should. Because of their mother's hatred for Reginald Sr., he no longer played a role in raising them after they separated. Reginald Jr. didn't talk much about his father's absence, and if he did miss him, he didn't show it, but Jonathan, on the other hand, was crushed not seeing his dad as much. He was younger and idolized his dad still, and the divorce had been much harder on him. When their mother remarried, it was right around the time that Jonathan started attending grade school, and Reginald Jr. was around 8 years old. Under normal circumstances, having a step-parent at that age might help to create a stable environment for young children, but nothing about the brothers' circumstances was normal. Janice became emotionally detached, and she started frequently dumping them at the homes of relatives to stay for long periods of time. Many of these family members had substance abuse issues, which only made things worse for the children when their mom vanished for days and weeks at a time. And when Janice was around, she was known to be a brutal disciplinarian and frequently resorted to using objects from the home to punish them. And the punishments would escalate to varying degrees of severity that seemed to be based almost solely on the mood she was in. Adding to the physical trauma and abandonment, Janice and her husband and the family they were often forced to stay with exposed the boys to inappropriate behavior. It's thought that this might have been directed at the 2 boys on occasion, but this has never been fully substantiated. In any case, the exposure in itself was enough for both brothers to develop some troubling tendencies at an early age. Jonathan, for example, started having an inappropriate relationship with one of his cousins, and Reginald had found private pictures of his mother and stepfather at some point during his grade school years, which he kept all the way until his early 20s. With so much dysfunction, it's no surprise that both Reginald and Jonathan also began to display aggressive behavior toward women before their teenage years. Some of the first instances of this predatory behavior occurred on girls their mother was paid to babysit. Then, in their teenage years, the brothers started joining various gangs in the neighborhood for that sense of belonging they didn't have at home. With so many negative influences surrounding Reginald and Jonathan, making it through school was one of the last things on their mind. From kindergarten through the 8th grade, Reginald had so many issues that he was kicked out of 8 separate schools. On one of these occasions, he had harassed one of his teachers. This was something he developed a reputation for already by this point. Another one of these was for another assault against a female student. Around the same time as well, at just 11 and 9 years old, their uncles started to allow them to drink alcohol and began teaching them about selling drugs. Then, by the time Reginald was in his early teens, Janice, his mother, was regularly buying drugs for him. Some other troubling behavior they were known to engage in was finding animals to shoot with their BB guns. When they couldn't find animals to shoot, they resorted to shooting one another. In one instant, one of these BBs entered deep enough that it remained lodged in Reginald's head even into adulthood. And this behavior would only escalate as the boys grew older. In December 2000, so now in their early 20s, Reginald and Jonathan left Dodge City, headed toward Wichita, Kansas. After the nearly 2.5-hour drive, the two brothers arrived at the relatively small but bustling city. On December 7th, 2000, at around 10:45 p.m., Andrew Schreiber, the 23-year-old assistant baseball coach, went to a convenience store at 21st and Woodlawn in East Wichita. He parked his 1998 Ford Expedition on the side of the convenience store and then went around the front and inside. After buying something, he walked back to his SUV, not realizing that another person was walking directly toward him at an angle. He unlocked the driver's side door, began sitting down, and that's when he noticed the man walking toward him. He also noticed the man was holding a small black semi-automatic handgun. By the time Andrew had closed the driver's side door, the man had already closed the distance and pointed the weapon at him with its barrel pressed against the glass. Andrew quickly weighed his options, but ultimately chose to open the door, hoping that doing what the man said would save his life. The man then instructed Andrew to slide over from the driver's seat to the front passenger seat. As Andrew started to do this, the man immediately pistol-whipped him across the back of the head and shouted for him to hurry up. Once Andrew was in the passenger seat, the man got in, shifted the SUV into reverse, backed out of the convenience store parking lot, and calmly drove down the street. The man then asked Andrew if he had any money. Andrew answered yes, and then took his wallet out and gave it to the man. After a short drive, they pulled into an alley where Andrew saw another man also holding a gun. He then approached the passenger side window, and for the second time that night, Andrew had a gun.
It seems we have company, Happy-sama.
The man in the passenger seat then ordered Andrew to open the door and to get into the back seat. And again, as he was doing this, he was pistol-whipped, this time by the second man, who also shouted at him not to look at either of them. The two men then asked Andrew if he had an ATM card and handed his wallet back to him. He pulled out his card from the wallet and handed it to them, hoping that this would be enough to convince him to let them go. Reginald Jr. and Jonathan Carr may or may not have come to Wichita planning to rob anyone, but once they were there, realizing they were short on funds, they looked for someone to target. Unfortunately for Andrew, he was just in the wrong spot at the wrong time. Reginald, who was driving, eventually pulled the SUV into a bank parking lot and close enough that Andrew could reach it from the back window. The brothers then had Andrew pull out the maximum amount the ATM would allow at a time.
I just got into Mugen about a month ago. Sorry community admins, etc is all new to me pyon.
Making sure he did as he was told.
I think I saw Cory follow if so he's my friend HE also stream Mugen.
As they drove down the highway, both brothers demanded that Andrew hand over any valuables he had with him. Andrew began taking off his silver watch, and while doing so, turned his head in a way that caused Jonathan to think that he was trying to look at his face. Whether that was the case or not, Jonathan pistol-whipped Andrew again and told him not to look at them. It was almost as if Jonathan enjoyed being given any excuse. The brothers then discussed what they were going to do with Andrew and decided that it would be best to drop him off on some random dirt road and then let him walk. The dirt roads they drove down were all bordered by open fields, which grew crops in the summer and fall.
Yeah, I do stream Mugen, I do 3v3 random battle.
It was near freezing, with winds gusting up to 25 miles an hour.
I also stream Mugen.
Andrew might have been wondering if his frozen body would be found in one of these fields. At some point, the brothers decided that the dirt roads weren't remote enough, and so they turned the SUV back around and back toward the city. As they drove back in, they talked about how nice the SUV was and commented about how they always wanted one just like it. As they did this, they seemed to enjoy looking back for a reaction from Andrew as he thought about the implications of what they were saying. Jonathan then told Andrew that he'd be taking off his pants and shoes when they kicked him out so he could enjoy the weather while he walked. Finally, Reginald stopped the SUV at a car wash and told Andrew to get down on the floor. The brothers decided that they would take him to their original vehicle and wanted to make sure that he didn't know what kind of car they drove. They drove for a little while longer, and then Andrew felt the SUV come to a stop once more. One of them got out and got into their other car. Then
Go,
Reginald told
hello
Jonathan
and
to follow him,
thanks
and the
for
two of
the
them both
follow
pulled away
pyon.
together.
I'm
This
trying
went on
to
for what
make
seemed
a
like an
weave
hour, and then to
mugen
Andrew's
where
horror,
you
he
guys
heard the
can use
SUV's tires
channel
hit
points
gravel as it
to
started
nerf,
down a much
buff,
darker
change the
road.
version of the
Then he heard the SUV's
characters.
engine shut off, and the sound of
Yes,
cloth wiping down the
HE
hard
does
surface of the
HE has
dashboard.
a organized
His heart
roster.
pounded as he waited to find out what they had planned for him. After a minute or two, Jonathan told Andrew he could find his car keys on the gravel road after they had left. A few seconds went
Yes,
by, and
it's
Andrew heard
nice
several
so
gunshots
far.
go off in quick succession. Reginald then told him to wait 20 minutes before doing anything, and then he heard the sound of them getting into their car and driving away. He then peeked over the front seat and out the windshield and saw the taillights of the car fade away into the distance. It seemed like Andrew's ordeal was over, and he was lucky to escape with his life. Thankfully, the brothers had shot out only one of his tires instead of all of them, so he immediately got into the driver's seat and drove right home to call 911. He then told police everything he knew about the incident and the two
Now
men,
I'm
but
on
unfortunately for the
Demon
residents of
Slayer
Wichita, this was
characters
only
now.
the beginning. At about 9:40 p.m. on December 11th, so 4 days after Andrew's nightmare, 55-year-old Anne Walenta, a cellist with the Wichita Symphony Orchestra, was heading to her home in
Please
East
use
Wichita.
your points
Driving a
when
brand new
the
GMC
journey
Yukon,
starts
she
to
noticed
buff
that a
the
newer,
bunny
light-colored
characters
car
pyon
seemed to be following, or at
X3.
the very least happened to be going to a destination
Speaking
close to
of
where she was
Mugen
headed.
Community, I
As she
have
turned
a
down a few
friend
side streets
named
and then went to her street, it seemed even more likely
SBKHE
the car
makes
was actually following her.
characters Corey
Anne
knows
pulled into
who
her
in
driveway and
talking
watched in her
about.
mirrors as the vehicle pulled into the front of one of Anne's neighbor's houses. A man then got out of the front passenger side of the car and began walking towards the driver's side of her car. As the man approached, he seemed to say something, so Anne rolled down her driver's side window just a few inches to hear him better. It only took her seconds to realize how big of a mistake that was. Before she could react, the man pulled out a gun and pointed it at Anne's head through the small gap in the window. In a panic, Anne turned the key in the ignition and heard the grinding of the engine because it was already running. The man then yelled at Anne not to move her car, but she didn't listen and threw the SUV into reverse. The next thing she heard was a loud explosion that made her ears ring. As her vision began to fade, she watched as the gunman ran back to his car. Her vision started to fade to black, and her head tipped forward against the Yukon's steering wheel. With her head pressed against the wheel, Anne's neighbor from across the street heard the
During
blaring
the
sound of the car
journey,
horn.
I'll be
Looking out
trying
the window,
to
the
make
neighbor
the
realized that the
guilty
honking was coming from Anne's house, and
XRD
the hazard lights in
characters
the car were
into
flashing.
Mugen.
Between the time it took
Yes.
for the neighbor to open her front door and start running towards Anne's SUV, Anne regained consciousness and began calling for help. As she pressed on the wound on her head, she slumped backward in the driver's seat. Then, as her neighbor approached, she yelled to her husband to call the police and realized that the front driver's side window had been shattered and glass was all over Anne's lap. The neighbor then asked what happened, and Anne tried to describe the shooter in the incident, but because of her injuries and how quickly it all happened, each time she told the story, the details were a little different. In those few short seconds, Anne was shot 3 times. One of the rounds severed her spinal cord, causing her to lose the use of her legs. She would spend the
My
next several weeks in the
favorite
hospital, and
guilty
things
gear
seemed to recover
character
well,
is
despite the
Gigi.
fact that she was now a paraplegic. She was doing so well that doctors scheduled her to be transferred to a rehab facility on January 2nd. However, the same day she was supposed to be transferred, she passed away as a result of suffering a blood clot that blocked blood flow to an artery in her lungs. This was as a direct result of the injuries she suffered during the shooting. It's possible that Reginald and Jonathan had killed people prior to this incident, but this would come to be the first definitive kill on their record. And horrifyingly, for the residents of Wichita, this was still only the beginning. 3 days later, on December 14th, a group of friends planned to get together at a home shared by friends Jason, Aaron, and
Not
Brett.
sure though
At the
if
get-together
I'll
were
release
Jason
them
and his
though
girlfriend
since
Holly, and
I
Holly had
care
brought along her
about
dog.
how credits
Aaron was
and
also there
such
with a friend of his
works.
named Heather, and finally Brad was there too, and he was alone. At about 10:30, Holly started to get ready for bed and pulled back her hair and tied it in a bun on the top of her head. Before joining Holly in bed, Jason switched the front porch light off and double-checked the front door to make sure it was locked. A few minutes later, after
Corey,
Jason
you
and
and
Holly had laid down, they both
SSBK
noticed the
should
front porch
be
light
good
turned back on.
friends because
Then they heard a person's voice they
SSBK
didn't
also
recognize,
like
and then their
Bakien
bedroom door
from
suddenly
Guilty
burst
Gear.
open, and they were staring at a man pointing a gun directly at them. The gunman pulled the covers off Jason and Holly, and Jason screamed in panic. A second gunman came in the room, holding Aaron by the shirt, and he pushed Aaron onto the couple's bed. One of the intruders asked if anyone else was in the home, and one of the 3 told the men that Brad was downstairs. One of the men then went to get Brad while the others watched them, and he repeatedly asked if anyone else was in the home and told them not to lie. Aaron finally relented and told the man that Heather was in a bedroom upstairs. Eventually, the other man came back into the room with Brad and carrying a golf club and yelled at Brad to get on the ground. The other man then went to the bedroom where Heather was, brought her back to Jason's room, and ordered her to lie down
ア
on
イ
the
シン
floor.
クアイメント
With everyone in the house now
SSBK
in the
from
same
a
room, the
video
men
of
demanded
his
to know where the phones were and if there was a
I
safe
know I
anywhere in
am
the
his
house.
friend
One of them then
LOL.
left the room, searching around the house for any valuables, while the other stayed to watch the rest of them. Holly's dog had also been barking non-stop since the brothers burst into their home, and this eventually got on the brothers' nerves. One of them then threatened to
I
shoot the
text
dog
him
unless they made it
sometimes
stop barking,
it's
so they
just
ended up putting a muzzle
he
over
is
the dog's
busy
mouth.
most of the time.
Next, they asked them for any cash
He's
they had on hand and how
sleeping
much money
right
was in
now,
each of
I
their bank
think.
accounts. Unfortunately for all of them, the brothers didn't just want their material possessions. Once they had gotten all of their financial information, they ordered them to take off their clothes. They then pulled everything out of the closet in the room and ordered all 5 of them to sit down inside and not say a word. After talking with each other for a short time, they ordered Holly and Heather out of the closet and led them to the bar area outside Jason's bedroom. They then yelled at the 2 women and demanded they engage in relations with one another. Terrified, the women did as they were told, but that wasn't enough for Reginald and Jonathan. Eventually, they brought all 3 of the men out of the closet and ordered each of them to take turns on Holly. Due to the circumstances, both Jason and Brad couldn't or refused to, but this only angered the brothers, and they threatened to take care of all of them if they didn't do as they were told. They then told Aaron to engage with Holly, but he told them that he didn't want to. One of the brothers then hit him in the back of the head and ordered Holly back into the closet. They then brought Heather back out and threatened to shoot them all again if they didn't perform this time. Holly sat terrified in the closet as she listened as the horror unfolded just outside the doors. Once the brothers were satisfied, Reginald told Brad to get the keys to Jason's pickup truck so he could withdraw money from ATMs. After they left, things only got worse inside the home. Jonathan brought each of the women out of the closet individually and engaged with them before returning them to the closet shortly after. Around 30 minutes later, Reginald and Brad returned, and this time Reginald took Jason out and got money from 2 more ATMs and then returned to the residence about 20 minutes later. When the two brothers began discussing who should go to the ATM next, Holly volunteered. Reginald then ordered Holly to get in the driver's seat of the pickup while he got in and sat in a slouched position in the passenger seat and pointed his gun at her. After withdrawing money, they drove back to the home and Holly asked Reginald if they were going to shoot all of them. Reginald said no, but Holly wasn't convinced by his answer. She then asked him to promise that he and the other men
Why
wouldn't shoot
some
them, and he
characters
finally said
will
again
a
he
million
wouldn't.
files for
Holly and
different
Reginald then
AI
continued to have
pion.
small talk on the way back.
Hoppibri,
Once they got there and
hoppibri.
were walking up to the house, Reginald told her that he wished they met under different circumstances. He even went as far as to say he could see himself dating her. Once Holly joined the rest of them back in the closet, she told them that she thought things were going to be okay and that she didn't think they were going to shoot them. Then, one by one, each of the friends left with Reginald went to 1 or more ATMs and then returned to the closet. At some point during one of these ATM runs, Jonathan opened the closet door and asked the remaining 4 if they wanted some whiskey. They all refused, and then after closing the closet door, they heard Jonathan going through their stuff. Not long after that, he opened the closet door again with an engagement ring which
I
Jason
don't
had bought to
know,
ask Holly
Pyon.
to marry him. Up to this point, Holly had no idea that Jason even intended to propose. Once Reginald returned with Aaron from their ATM run, he ordered Holly out of the closet and both brothers took turns with each of them several more times. Then after going through the house again, Reginald and Jonathan began cleaning and wiping surfaces throughout the home to get rid of their fingerprints. Once they were finished, the brothers forced Holly and Heather, who were still naked, into the trunk of Aaron's car. The brothers then attempted to force all 3 men into the trunk as well, but quickly realized they wouldn't all fit. Not wanting to risk dealing with 3 grown men in the same vehicle, they took Holly and Heather out and forced the 3 men inside the trunk instead. One of the brothers then told Holly to get inside the pickup truck and sit on the passenger side, and then Jonathan took Heather and got into the other car. Reginald and Holly then followed the car in the pickup truck to some unknown destination. As they drove, Holly asked Reginald where they were going, and Reginald responded that he was taking them to a place where they wouldn't be able to contact police too quickly. She felt a little bit better hearing that, but also wondered why he wasn't worried about their faces being seen. Holly then looked at the clock in the pickup truck's dashboard and it read 2:07 a.m. The brothers then drove both vehicles to a soccer field where they made Holly and Heather sit in the car while they discussed what should happen next. After a few minutes, the brothers ordered the 3 men out of the trunk and told them to kneel in front of the car. Upon seeing this, Holly cried out that they were going to shoot everyone. Seconds later, the brothers ordered the 2 women to exit the car next and kneel next to the 3 men.
by categories
Without
bomb.
hesitation, Reginald and Jonathan then shot each one of them from behind. Right before Aaron was shot, he tried to reason with the men, but it made no difference. When it first started, there was lots of noise, but by the time it was Holly's turn, everything had gone silent. She didn't even hear the shot that hit her in the head, and everything just turned gray. She stayed on her knees for a few seconds until one of the brothers kicked her over. Then she fell forward in her face.
You
hit the cold
mean
ground.
getting
As
characters?
she faded in and out of consciousness, she heard the voices of the 2 men who had terrorized them for hours start to fade away. She heard the pickup truck doors open and shut, and then she felt the impact of one of the truck tires hitting her as she drove off. She laid there a little while longer, and then once she was confident the pickup truck and the men inside were far enough down the street, she looked over and watched it drive into the distance. It was only after the taillights were gone completely that she got up and started checking on everyone else. To her horror, none of them responded. She then looked around and saw a house off in the distance with bright blinking Christmas lights, and incredibly, she then ran barefoot without any clothes on for over a mile. She ran through snow-covered fields, climbed over fences, some of them with barbed wire, and finally she reached the house. At 2:15 a.m. on December 15th, Steve Johnson and his wife heard someone pounding loudly on their front door and ringing their doorbell. Steve looked outside the window and upon seeing a frantic and bloody Holly, ran to the door and flung it open. Barely hanging on to life, Holly used whatever strength she had.
Okay, I'll put my headset on.
To both Steve and his wife. And upon hearing that Holly had been shot, they noticed that blood was trickling down the back of her neck, and her hair was matted with blood. After calling 911 and making sure...
Oh no, I go by, oh, you can hear me. No. I go by, franchises.
This way, if she passed away before police got there, any statement she made during the 911 call would be recorded and would be...
I go by franchises, pyon.
And incredibly again, Holly was then able to provide a fairly detailed...
For example, the reason...
By the time Holly was placed in an ambulance and on her way to the nearest trauma center, county deputies...
for me, I'm just like,
First on the
oh, wait. Is the thingy too loud? Hopefully not. Not me too loud. Okay, so I'll go by franchise.
All four of them would pass away.
So like right here is Sailor Moon franchise on the one row. Next row is Arcana Heart.
At around 4 a.m., an officer was...
I think I'm going to have like MVC2 characters in a MVC2 category.
I see. Well, you see, like I have like for me, I try to find the quote best AI for each one. So if that's the MVC version of them, or the POTS version of them, or an edit of them, like I'll download that one. Well, then that's the representation of that character for this tournament.
Reginald told the sergeant that he was looking for his
every character gets one representation in here. Now, if you guys know of a better AI one, you guys could suggest it, but yeah.
Breaking news reports of a quadruple homicide overnight. Police asked the viewers to keep an eye out for
as long as they're not broken in terms of just like completely taking the whole screen of just randomness or joke characters or cheat characters like that. The AI can be as annoying as the AI can be cheap. No, not cheap. The AI can be like cheesy, constantly doing the same move over and over and over again. That's fine. That's fine. The only characters that are banned from here are non-anime characters, or characters that are not from an anime-ish game or Japanese game. Few broken characters or busted characters. 3 characters that are 3D modeled, that don't look like, that don't fit like the aesthetic of it. So like shading wise and such.
As a result, plenty of tips started coming in.
Like Joker, like here, like Joker is like the closest that I can get to like that I will allow for 3D characters.
Whichever was the case, Jonathan did very little to cover his involvement in the crime. He didn't even leave the area. He just called a friend of his and asked her to pick him up from the Amtrak train station. His excuse was that he had missed a train headed to Cleveland.
Like Joker looks fine. Joker looks fine.
Right away, the female friend found it odd that someone would be absent-minded enough to miss their train. The tickets may have cost less than plane tickets, but they still weren't cheap, especially for someone with no job and barely any money. But in spite of all that, she decided to do Jonathan the favor, picked him up, and drove him to the house.
Any other like super 3D characters, or you can easily tell they are 3D, or like they don't match, then.
Another thing that stuck out in the friend's mind was the fact that after picking Jonathan up,
but I go by franchises though, so.
One thing she knew about Jonathan was that he remained perpetually broke. He responded,
I need to see these characters broken.
Bank account. That answer made things even stranger because last she knew, not only was he jobless and broke, he never mentioned even having a bank account.
And a lot of these, and also too, a lot of these characters, I'm gonna have to go into their files and change how they look. Like some of them have like broken was it where's an example here? Yeah, like this one here. Like some of them have like this, which I'm gonna have to go back and edit it. Eventually, I'm gonna have to edit this
I'm
thing.
back was texting a different friend.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but yeah, I go by franchises, so. But eventually, I'm gonna go back and fix these guys though. These characters with the messed up picture.
His friend then continued pushing him for an explanation. First, him and Reginald's
Is
clothing
Corey
matched
still
exactly
here?
what was being broadcast on every news channel.
Maybe.
She then told him that unless he had an alibi, that story wouldn't.
Let's see. Okay, let's see if these characters are broken.
Tears started streaming down his cheeks, and the only thing he said was that they had gotten his brother. At around 11,
Nazarene. Nazarine's pretty cute for a mouse.
And a breaking news alert interrupted her program to report an arrest in the quadruple homicide. Her knees almost buckled when she heard the name Reginald Carr. The reporter added that they were still looking for a second man who might have been driving an older model white Plymouth town car. Her mother ran to the window, looked out, and
I prefer random battles.
matched exactly. In complete panic now, she called for her daughter to come upstairs, all while trying to sound as calm as possible. She then asked her daughter if the police were looking for Jonathan for the murders the night before. Her daughter nodded, and then her
me right now. I'm just seeing to make sure these characters aren't. Right now, I'm just trying to make sure these characters are not busted.
To leave right away. They then quietly exited their house and briskly walked to a neighbor's house across the street. And shortly after the mother began speaking with the 911 operator, Jonathan came to the front door and gestured.
Okay, that.
It's safe to assume that the reason they left was written all over their faces upon seeing Jonathan come to the front.
Okay, I mean that looks fine. That looks manageable.
The social cues, or knowing that his brother had been arrested, he simply didn't care. And then a few minutes later, the police arrived and Jonathan burst through the back door. He ran down an alley, but was caught shortly after. Along with the matching clothing description, police found over $1,000 in various pockets.
Did she send out a turtle?
Female friend. Officers then found the stolen engagement ring that Jason had planned to give Holly. When Andrew, the first robber,
Lolly with an
saw
AK.
the two brothers' arrests on the news, he informed investigators that they were the men who robbed him. At this point as well, Anne was still alive and in recovery, so she was able to identify.
Yep, there you go. That's a booking right there.
And Holly, who had spent the most
Kaguya.
So she was able to identify the brothers right away as the men who had come to their home.
Kaguya's broken.
Reginald Jr. and Jonathan Carr were eventually charged with a total of 113 different crimes. Reginald was eventually convicted of 50 separate crimes, while Jonathan was convicted of 43. They were both given the death penalty.
Yeah.
Hello everyone, welcome to Something Interesting. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to send those directly to the email in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. In 1788, the British began sending prisoners to Australia to alleviate their overcrowded prisons. And
hopefully this one isn't busted.